Did you know the Pokémon universe contains one of the most intricate creation mythologies ever conceived, spanning billions of years from the birth of reality itself to the modern era of Pokémon trainers? Tonight we'll journey through this vast timeline, exploring how legendary Pokémon shaped not just their world, but continue to influence events across dimensions and through time itself. From the primordial void where existence began to the complex multiverse we know today, these ancient beings represent forces so fundamental that without them, nothing we recognize would exist. So settle in as we uncover the complete story of legendary Pokémon, their eternal conflicts, and the delicate balance they maintain between order and chaos. In the beginning, there was nothing. Not darkness, not light, not even the concept of absence itself. This wasn't merely empty space waiting to be filled, but a true void where the very notion of existence had yet to take root. Yet within this incomprehensible nothingness, a single anomaly persisted, a solitary egg floating in the conceptual space that would one day become reality. This egg contained within it the potential for everything that ever was, is, or could be. The being that emerged from this cosmic egg would come to be known by many names across countless cultures and civilizations, but most commonly as Arceus. However, the form we recognize today as Arceus is merely a fraction of its true essence, shaped down to something mortal minds can perceive without being overwhelmed by its infinite nature. The true form of this primordial entity exists beyond physical description, beyond the limitations of shape, size, or substance. It is the Alpha Pokémon not because it was the first, but because it is the source from which the concept of first derives meaning. Upon awakening in the void, Arceus faced the monumental task of creating existence itself. This wasn't simply a matter of willing things into being, but of establishing the fundamental forces that would allow reality to function. The entity's first creations would need to be beings capable of governing the most basic aspects of existence. Pokémon so powerful and so intrinsically connected to reality's foundation that they would essentially become living embodiments of universal constants. From its own essence, Arceus shaped three distinct beings, each designed to oversee a crucial aspect of the universe it was about to create. The first of these was Dialga, formed to govern the flow of time itself. Without time, nothing could begin, develop, or end. Events could not follow one another in sequence, growth could not occur, and the very concept of causality would be meaningless. Dialga's creation established the forward momentum that would drive all existence from this moment onward. The second being was Palkia, tasked with controlling space and the relationships between objects within it. While time provided sequence and duration, space provided the stage upon which all events would unfold. Palkia's domain encompassed not just physical distance, but the fundamental concept of separation that allows distinct things to exist without merging into a singular, undifferentiated mass. Through Palkia's influence, the universe would have dimension, allowing for the complex interactions between matter and energy that make life possible. The third creation was perhaps the most paradoxical. Giratina was formed to embody antimatter, representing the opposite of everything that would exist in the primary universe. In physics, antimatter serves as a counterbalance to regular matter, and similarly, Giratina's role was to provide the necessary opposing force that would prevent the universe from becoming static and unchanging. However, this opposition was not meant to be destructive, but rather to introduce the tension and conflict necessary for growth and evolution. These three Pokémon, in their original forms, bore little resemblance to how they appear to modern observers. Dialga's origin form was a more abstract representation of time's flow, with crystalline structures that seem to bend and twist through dimensions that don't exist in normal space. Its body incorporated elements that appeared to age and renew simultaneously, creating a visual paradox that reflected its dominion over temporal forces. The adamant crystal that would later become associated with Dialga was originally an integral part of its being, not a separate artifact, but a focal point where its temporal powers were most concentrated. Palkia's origin form was equally alien to conventional perception. Its body seemed to exist in multiple locations simultaneously, creating an unsettling effect where observers might see different aspects of the Pokémon depending on their vantage point. The lustrous pearl that modern mythology associates with Palkia was originally the core of its spatial manipulation abilities, a point from which it could reshape the very fabric of space itself. In this form, Palkia could compress vast distances into nothing or stretch a single point across infinity. Giratina's origin form was perhaps the most disturbing to behold. Unlike its matter-based siblings, Giratina's body incorporated principles that were fundamentally opposed to normal existence. Parts of it seemed to exist in negative space, creating voids in reality where it passed. Its movements left distortions in the fabric of space-time, small tears where the normal rules of physics broke down. The Griseous orb that would later contain its power was originally a constantly shifting aperture through which antimatter energy flowed into the primary universe in carefully controlled amounts. For a time that cannot be measured in any conventional sense, since time itself was still being defined, these four beings worked in harmony. Arceus provided the creative force and overall direction, while its three children established the fundamental framework within which the universe would operate. Dialga ensured that events could unfold in proper sequence. Palkia provided the dimensional structure necessary for complexity, and Giratina introduced the opposing forces that would drive change and evolution. However, as the universe began to take shape and the first matter started condensing from pure energy, problems began to emerge with Giratina's role. The antimatter forces it controlled were inherently destructive to the reality that Arceus was attempting to create. While small amounts of opposition were necessary for growth, Giratina's influence was proving too chaotic, too fundamentally opposed to the ordered universe that was taking shape, where Dialga and Palkia worked to establish stability and structure. Giratina's very presence introduced unpredictability and destruction. The breaking point came when Giratina's violent tendencies began actively disrupting the delicate work of universal creation. Its antimatter essence wasn't content to simply provide opposition, but seemed driven to actively tear apart the structures its siblings were building. Space would warp unpredictably in its presence. Time would flow backward or skip forward randomly, and the carefully balanced forces holding the nascent universe together would fluctuate wildly. This behavior wasn't born from malice or evil intent, but from Giratina's fundamental nature as an embodiment of antimatter. Just as antimatter naturally annihilates regular matter upon contact, Giratina's existence was naturally opposed to the ordered reality its creator was establishing. However, understanding the cause didn't make the effects any less devastating to the cosmic project underway. Arceus faced an agonizing decision. Destroying Giratina was impossible without fundamentally altering the balance of forces necessary for a complete universe. Antimatter remained an essential component of reality's structure. Yet allowing Giratina to remain in the primary universe would eventually lead to the destruction of everything they had worked to create. The solution, when it came, was as elegant as it was harsh. Using its supreme power over reality itself, Arceus created an entirely separate dimension, one where the normal rules of physics were inverted or suspended entirely. This realm, which would come to be known as the Distortion World, was specifically designed to contain Giratina's antimatter essence without allowing it to interfere with the primary universe. In this dimension, gravity might flow upward, time could move in circles, and space could fold back on itself in impossible ways. The banishment of Giratina was not meant as punishment in any human sense of the word, but as a necessary isolation to protect the greater cosmic order. Within the Distortion World, Giratina would have complete dominion, free to express its antimatter nature without restraint. The dimension was crafted to be Giratina's perfect environment, a place where its destructive tendencies would be constructive instead, constantly reshaping and reforming a reality that could withstand such treatment. However, this separation created an unintended consequence. Cut off from direct interaction with the primary universe, Giratina began to interpret its situation as exile and rejection. Over eons of isolation, what had been a natural expression of antimatter forces gradually developed into genuine resentment toward its creator and siblings. The Pokémon that had been formed without malice slowly developed it through loneliness and perceived abandonment. With Giratina safely contained, Arceus could focus on completing the universe's basic structure. However, creating the stage for existence was only the first step. For reality to fulfill its potential, it would need to be inhabited by conscious beings capable of growth, learning, and creation of their own. Yet, consciousness itself presented unique challenges that the fundamental forces alone couldn't address. Arceus realized that consciousness required more than just time, space, and opposition to function. Thinking beings needed knowledge to understand their world, emotion to drive them toward goals, and willpower to overcome obstacles and make choices. These aspects of consciousness were too complex and too important to emerge randomly from the interplay of cosmic forces. Thus, Arceus created 3 more Pokémon, each designed to embody and nurture a crucial aspect of consciousness itself. These beings would be smaller and less cosmically powerful than the creation trio, but their influence would be more intimate, directly touching the minds and hearts of thinking creatures throughout the universe. The first of these new Pokémon was Uxie, formed to represent and promote knowledge. Uxie's role was to ensure that conscious beings could learn from their experiences, accumulate wisdom, and pass understanding on to future generations. Without knowledge, consciousness would be trapped in an eternal present, unable to build upon past experiences or plan for future needs. Uxie's influence would make possible the development of science, philosophy, and all forms of learning. The second was Mesprit, created to embody emotion and feeling. While knowledge provided the raw material for consciousness, emotion provided the motivation and meaning that would drive conscious beings to action. Joy, sorrow, love, fear, and all the complex feelings that make consciousness more than mere mechanical calculation flowed from Mesprit's influence. Through emotion, thinking beings would form bonds with each other and find reasons to strive for more than mere survival. The third was Azelf, representing willpower and the ability to make choices. Knowledge and emotion alone weren't sufficient for true consciousness, which required the ability to weigh options and commit to courses of action. Azelf's gift was the capacity for determination, the strength to pursue long-term goals despite immediate obstacles, and the freedom to choose one's own path rather than being bound by instinct or circumstance. Unlike the creation trio, these 3 Pokémon were designed to work closely together, their influences interweaving to create the complex tapestry of consciousness. They would eventually make their home at the bottom of 3 lakes in what would become the Sinnoh region, staying close enough to the physical world to directly influence the development of thinking beings while remaining hidden from casual observation. The creation of these 6 Pokémon marked the completion of the universe's fundamental structure. The stage was set, the basic forces established, and the capacity for consciousness implemented. Reality now possessed everything necessary for the complex interactions between matter, energy, and thought that would drive the development of life throughout the cosmos. Yet even as Arceus contemplated the next phase of creation, the influence of its first works continued to spread. Dialga's mastery over time meant that causality now functioned consistently throughout reality. Events would have consequences, actions would lead to reactions, and the universe would develop according to logical principles rather than random chaos. This temporal structure would make possible the formation of stable matter, the evolution of complexity, and eventually, the development of life itself. Palkia's control over space established the dimensional framework that would allow for the incredible diversity of forms and structures the universe would eventually contain. From the largest galaxy clusters to the smallest subatomic particles, everything would exist within the spatial relationships that Palkia maintained. This wasn't simply empty void waiting to be filled, but an active medium that could support the intricate relationships between objects necessary for complex phenomena. Even Giratina, isolated in its distortion world, continued to play a crucial role in the cosmic balance. The antimatter forces it embodied provided the necessary opposition that prevented the universe from becoming perfectly ordered and therefore static. Tiny amounts of chaos and unpredictability leaked through from the distortion world, introducing the random elements that would drive evolution and prevent reality from crystallizing into unchanging perfection. The three-lake Pokémon, though not yet in their final positions, began their subtle work of preparing the universe for consciousness. Their influence was felt in the earliest quantum fluctuations, helping to establish the information processing principles that would eventually make thought possible. Every particle interaction carried the potential for knowledge, emotion, and choice that would someday manifest in thinking beings. As this primordial age drew to a close, the universe had transformed from absolute nothingness into a reality with infinite potential. The basic forces were established. The capacity for consciousness was embedded in the very structure of existence, and the stage was set for the next phase of creation. Soon, the first matter would begin condensing from energy. The first simple structures would form, and the long journey toward life would begin. Yet already, in these earliest moments of existence, the patterns that would define the entire history of the Pokémon universe were taking shape. The balance between order and chaos, the interplay of opposing forces, and the fundamental importance of consciousness in driving reality forward were all established in this primordial period. Every legendary Pokémon that would later emerge, every conflict that would shake the foundations of existence, and every triumph of life over entropy could trace its origins back to these first creative acts of Arceus and its initial children. The genesis of everything was complete, and the universe was ready to begin its long evolution toward the rich, complex reality, filled with Pokémon and humans that we know today. But that story would require eons to unfold, beginning with the formation of matter itself and the shaping of the first worlds where life could take root and flourish. With the fundamental forces of reality established and the capacity for consciousness embedded in the universe's structure, Arceus turned its attention to the next phase of creation. The cosmic framework existed, but it remained largely empty, filled with energy and potential but lacking the complex structures that would eventually support life. The time had come to begin shaping actual worlds, to transform the abstract possibilities of space and time into concrete realities where consciousness could take root and flourish. The first step in this process involved establishing a genetic foundation for all the diverse life forms that would eventually populate these worlds. For this crucial role, Arceus created Mew, a Pokémon whose genetic structure would serve as the template from which all other Pokémon would eventually derive their characteristics. Mew wasn't simply the first Pokémon in a biological sense, but rather the living embodiment of genetic possibility itself, containing within its cellular structure the dormant potential for every form of life that would ever exist. Mew's creation was fundamentally different from the cosmic entities that preceded it. While Dialga, Palkia, and Giratina were abstract forces given form, and the Lake Guardians were aspects of consciousness made manifest, Mew was the first truly biological entity in the universe. Its pink, feline form was deceptively simple, hiding a genetic complexity that defied conventional understanding. Every strand of Mew's DNA contained not just its own genetic information, but template patterns that could be activated and modified to produce any conceivable Pokémon species. This genetic versatility came with a unique characteristic that would distinguish Mew from almost all other legendary Pokémon. While most legendaries were tied to specific cosmic forces or geographical locations, Mew possessed an almost unlimited capacity for adaptation and learning. It could learn any technique that any Pokémon could master, adapt to any environment, and even temporarily alter its own cellular structure to mimic other species. This flexibility was essential for its role as the genetic ancestor of all Pokémon life. However, Mew's creation also established an important principle that would govern much of the universe's subsequent development. Unlike the creation trio, which were permanent fixtures of reality's structure, Mew was designed to be rare and elusive. It would not dominate the evolutionary process directly, but would instead serve as a hidden influence, its genetic legacy spreading through countless generations without most creatures ever knowing of their connection to this primordial ancestor. With the genetic foundation established, Arceus began the monumental task of creating the first physical worlds. This process required Pokémon capable of shaping matter on a planetary scale, beings whose power could transform raw energy into the complex geological structures necessary for supporting diverse ecosystems. The first of these world shapers was Kyogre, formed in the deepest parts of space where cosmic forces compressed hydrogen and helium into the heavier elements that would become the building blocks of planets. Kyogre's emergence marked the beginning of hydrological cycles throughout the universe. This Pokémon didn't simply create water, but established the principles by which moisture would move through planetary systems, cycling between liquid, vapor, and solid states to create the dynamic environments necessary for life. Kyogre's influence extended far beyond any single world, establishing patterns of ocean currents, precipitation, and atmospheric moisture that would shape climate systems throughout the cosmos. The Pokémon's original form was vastly more powerful than its modern appearance might suggest. Ancient texts speak of a primal Kyogre whose body was composed of living water that could exist in multiple states simultaneously. This primal form could compress entire ocean basins into its being, or expand to fill vast regions of space with life-giving moisture. The blue orb that would later be discovered by human civilizations was originally an integral part of Kyogre's body, a core of pure hydrological energy that could transform the water cycle of entire planets with its activation. As Kyogre began its work of creating the first oceans, the universe experienced its first taste of the conflicts that would become a recurring theme in legendary Pokémon relationships. The process of establishing stable hydrological cycles created enormous amounts of steam and vapor, which began condensing and cooling throughout space. This cooling effect threatened to freeze the early universe into static perfection, preventing the dynamic interactions that would be necessary for life's development. In response to this threat, Arceus created Groudon, a Pokémon whose role was diametrically opposed to Kyogre's but equally essential for planetary development. Where Kyogre embodied the flowing, adaptable nature of water, Groudon represented the solid, stable foundation of land and stone. Emerging from pools of cosmic magma where the first heavy elements had condensed into molten form, Groudon began the process of creating solid planetary surfaces that could support complex ecosystems. Groudon's primal form was a sight that defied conventional description. Its body incorporated active volcanic processes, with lava flowing through channels carved into its rocky skin and gases venting from pores along its massive frame. The red orb associated with Groudon in modern times was originally a core of pure geological energy, capable of triggering tectonic processes that could raise mountain ranges or open oceanic trenches with equal ease. When fully activated, primal Groudon could increase the temperature of entire planetary systems, ensuring that the cooling effects of widespread water didn't lock worlds into frozen stasis. The relationship between Kyogre and Groudon was inherently unstable, not due to any personal animosity, but because their fundamental natures were necessarily opposed. Kyogre's work required temperatures that would allow water to exist in liquid form, while Groudon's geological processes often generated heat that would vaporize water entirely. Similarly, Kyogre's erosional forces were constantly wearing down the land formations that Groudon created, while Groudon's volcanic activity could boil away the oceans that Kyogre had established. These conflicts weren't flaws in Arceus's design, but essential features of the planetary development process. The tension between land and sea, heat and cooling, stability and change, would drive the geological processes that created the diverse environments necessary for life. Mountain building, erosion, sedimentation, and volcanic activity all emerged from the dynamic interaction between these two opposing forces. However, the intensity of their conflicts soon proved problematic for the developing universe. When Kyogre and Groudon encountered each other directly, their battles could devastate entire planetary systems. Ocean worlds would be reduced to steam when Groudon's heat met Kyogre's waters, while terrestrial planets could be flooded beyond habitability when Kyogre's power overwhelmed Groudon's land-building efforts. These cosmic-scale battles threatened to destroy the very worlds they were meant to create. The situation reached a critical point when both Pokémon detected a massive meteor approaching one of the first stable planetary systems they had been developing. This wasn't an ordinary space rock, but a fragment from the universe's earliest moments, still carrying within it concentrations of the primordial energy that had existed before matter itself had fully condensed. The meteor contained what would later be recognized as the fundamental force behind mega evolution, a power that could temporarily restore Pokémon to forms more closely resembling their primordial states. Both Kyogre and Groudon recognized the incredible value of this energy source, but for different reasons. Kyogre saw the potential to use this power to accelerate the creation of water worlds, transforming entire galaxies into oceanic systems that could support aquatic life on an unprecedented scale. Groudon, conversely, viewed the meteor as a means to enhance its geological processes, potentially creating solid worlds so stable and resource-rich that they could support incredibly diverse terrestrial ecosystems. The battle that erupted over the meteor's possession was unlike anything the young universe had yet witnessed. Kyogre summoned typhoons that spanned light years, while Groudon triggered volcanic eruptions that threatened to crack planetary crusts throughout the system. Their conflict sent shockwaves through space-time itself, creating distortions that threatened to attract Giratina's attention from the distortion world. The resolution came from an unexpected source. High above the battlefield, a Pokémon that had been drifting through the cosmic void since the universe's earliest days finally awakened to the chaos below. Rayquaza had been created alongside the first matter, designed to serve as a mediator between the various forces that would shape planetary development. However, unlike Kyogre and Groudon, whose roles required them to be actively involved in world building, Rayquaza was meant to remain dormant until its intervention became necessary. Rayquaza's original form was even more alien than its modern appearance suggests. This Pokémon existed partially outside normal space-time, able to perceive the universe from perspectives that revealed the long-term consequences of actions across cosmic scales. Its serpentine body could stretch across solar systems when necessary, while its consciousness could simultaneously monitor thousands of developing worlds for signs of dangerous imbalance. The Pokémon's diet was as unusual as its nature. While other legendary Pokémon drew power from abstract forces or geological processes, Rayquaza sustained itself by consuming meteors and space debris, particularly fragments that contained high concentrations of cosmic energy. This feeding process wasn't just nutritional, but served to prevent potentially dangerous objects from impacting developing worlds. Over eons, Rayquaza had consumed countless meteors that might otherwise have caused extinction-level events on inhabited planets. When Rayquaza detected the battle between Kyogre and Groudon, it immediately recognized the threat their conflict posed to universal stability. The meteor they were fighting over contained enough primordial energy to fundamentally alter the cosmic balance if used improperly. Moreover, their battle was creating the kind of space-time distortions that could potentially weaken the barriers containing Giratina in the distortion world. Rayquaza's intervention was swift and decisive. Descending from the cosmic heights where it had been drifting, the Pokémon underwent the first mega evolution in universal history, temporarily accessing the full power of its primordial form. This transformation was possible because Rayquaza's unique diet of cosmic debris had allowed it to internalize the very energies that powered mega evolution, making it the only Pokémon capable of mega evolving without external assistance. In its mega form, Rayquaza possessed power that rivaled the creation trio themselves. Its Draco meteor attacks could shatter planets, while its ability to manipulate atmospheric conditions extended to controlling the space between worlds. Most importantly, its presence radiated a calming influence that could suppress the more destructive aspects of other legendary Pokémon's powers without completely negating their essential functions. The battle between the three titans lasted for what would have been eons in planetary time, though the flexible nature of time in these early cosmic periods makes precise measurement impossible. Rayquaza's strategy wasn't to defeat Kyogre and Groudon outright, but to demonstrate that their conflict was counterproductive to their ultimate goals. By showing them how their combined efforts could create more stable and diverse worlds than either could achieve alone, Rayquaza gradually convinced them to cease their hostilities. The resolution involved a carefully negotiated division of cosmic responsibilities. Kyogre would focus on creating oceanic worlds, and establishing hydrological cycles, but would avoid systems where Groudon was actively engaged in geological development. Groudon, in turn, would concentrate on building continental landmasses and maintaining geological stability, but would moderate its heat output to avoid vaporizing established water systems. The contested meteor would be broken apart, with portions going to both Pokémon to enhance their respective abilities. With this conflict resolved, Rayquaza returned to its role as cosmic mediator, drifting through space and monitoring the developing universe for signs of dangerous imbalance. However, the Pokémon's intervention had established an important precedent. When legendary Pokémon conflicts threatened universal stability, there existed a power capable of restraining them without permanent damage to either party. This knowledge would prove crucial in future eras when other legendary Pokémon came into conflict. The success of this mediation allowed planetary development to proceed at an unprecedented pace. Kyogre and Groudon, now working in coordination rather than opposition, began creating the diverse worlds that would eventually support the incredible variety of Pokémon species derived from Mew's genetic template. Ocean worlds, with vast archipelagos, continental systems with every possible climate zone, and hybrid environments that combined the best features of both land and sea, began appearing throughout the cosmos. However, the process of world building revealed a significant limitation in the current system. While Kyogre and Groudon could create the basic geological and hydrological structures necessary for habitable worlds, they couldn't provide the fine detail work needed to create the specific environmental niches that would support diverse ecosystems. Mountains, oceans, and continents were only the beginning. Complex life would require caves and caverns, specific mineral distributions, varied topographical features, and countless other small-scale geographical elements. Recognizing this need, Arceus created what would become one of the most important Pokémon in universal history, though one whose contributions would largely go unrecognized by later civilizations. Regigigas emerged from the intersection of cosmic forces and geological processes, a Pokémon whose power was specifically designed for the precise manipulation of planetary features on every scale from continental to microscopic. Regigigas was unlike any Pokémon created before it. While previous legendaries embodied abstract forces or biological principles, Regigigas was essentially a cosmic engineer, capable of visualizing optimal planetary configurations and then implementing them with incredible precision. Its massive form contained within it a complete understanding of geological processes, atmospheric dynamics, hydrological cycles, and the complex interactions between all these systems that were necessary for supporting life. The Pokémon's most remarkable ability was its capacity to literally move continents. Using a combination of incredible physical strength and sophisticated manipulation of gravitational fields, Regigigas could lift entire land masses and relocate them to optimal positions for supporting diverse ecosystems. This wasn't random rearrangement, but careful optimization based on factors like solar radiation patterns, atmospheric circulation, and the complex feedback loops that would develop between different environmental systems. Regigigas began its work by identifying planets that Kyogre and Groudon had created with good basic structure but suboptimal continental arrangements. On these worlds, it would carefully separate landmasses along natural geological boundaries, then drag them through the oceans to positions that would create more favorable climatic conditions. Continents were moved to latitudes that would give them appropriate temperature ranges, positioned to create favorable ocean current patterns, and arranged to ensure that atmospheric circulation would distribute moisture effectively. This continental engineering had effects that extended far beyond simple geography. By positioning landmasses optimally, Regigigas could create natural barriers that would allow different regions to develop distinct ecosystems in isolation, leading to the evolution of diverse Pokémon species adapted to specific environments. Conversely, it could also create land bridges and island chains that would allow genetic exchange between populations, preventing excessive specialization that might reduce overall adaptability. However, Regigigas soon realized that even its tremendous capabilities weren't sufficient for the incredibly detailed work that optimal world building required. Different types of geological processes required different approaches, and the Pokémon found that it needed assistance with specialized abilities to handle specific aspects of planetary engineering. To address this need, Regigigas created 5 subordinate Pokémon from its own essence, each designed to excel at particular types of geological manipulation. These weren't offspring in any biological sense, but rather extensions of Regigigas' own consciousness and power, given independent form so they could work simultaneously on different aspects of the same planetary system. Regirock was formed to handle all processes involving stone, minerals, and crystalline structures. This Pokémon could identify optimal locations for mountain ranges, determine the best compositions for different types of rock formations, and even influence the development of mineral deposits that would later be crucial for technological civilizations. Regirock's body was itself a constantly changing collection of different stone types, allowing it to experiment with various geological compositions and implement the most successful combinations on a planetary scale. Regice took responsibility for all processes involving cold, ice, and the preservation of geological features over long time periods. While Regirock created structures, Regice ensured their stability by managing erosion patterns, controlling glacial processes, and creating permanent ice features that could serve as long-term water storage systems. Regice's abilities extended beyond simple temperature control to include sophisticated manipulation of crystalline structures and the formation of complex ice formations that could channel water flow in optimal patterns. Registeel was designed to handle the formation and distribution of metallic elements throughout planetary crusts. This Pokémon could create ore deposits, establish the geological processes that would concentrate useful metals in accessible locations, and even influence the formation of naturally occurring alloys that would be valuable for future technological development. Registeel's body incorporated examples of every type of metal that existed in the universe, allowing it to understand their properties and optimal applications. The creation of these 3 Regis established a pattern that would be repeated throughout the universe's development. Complex tasks that required specialized knowledge were often handled by creating Pokémon specifically designed for those functions, rather than trying to give every legendary Pokémon unlimited versatility. This specialization allowed for more efficient and effective problem-solving, though it also created interdependencies that could become problematic if the specialist Pokémon were ever separated from their intended roles. As the Regis began their work of detailed planetary engineering, they encountered geological processes that hadn't been anticipated in their original design. Some worlds contained electrical phenomena that could influence crystalline formation and mineral distribution. Others had unusual electromagnetic fields that affected metal formation. To handle these new challenges, Regigigas eventually created 2 additional Regis with capabilities that reflected the growing complexity of the universe. Regieleki was formed to manage electrical processes that affected geological development. This Pokémon could control lightning patterns that influenced mineral formation, manage the electrical properties of different rock types, and even create naturally occurring electrical systems that could power future technological civilizations. Regieleki's abilities made it possible to create worlds with naturally occurring electrical phenomena that were stable enough to be utilized by intelligent life forms. Regidrago represented Regigigas' attempt to incorporate the legendary power of dragon-type energy into geological processes. This Pokémon could access the primordial forces that had shaped the early universe, using them to create geological features that incorporated aspects of cosmic energy. Regidrago's influence resulted in the formation of special crystalline structures and mineral compositions that could store and channel the same energies that powered legendary Pokémon themselves. The work of Regigigas and its 5 subordinates transformed the universe from a collection of basic planets into a vast array of diverse worlds, each optimized for supporting specific types of life and ecosystem development. However, their tremendous power also made them objects of fear for the first intelligent civilizations that encountered them. The ability to reshape continents and alter fundamental planetary processes was terrifying to beings whose entire existence depended on geological stability. This fear led to one of the first major conflicts between legendary Pokémon and intelligent life. Early civilizations, recognizing that the Regis possessed power that could destroy their entire worlds on a whim, developed sophisticated sealing technologies specifically designed to contain these Pokémon. Using a combination of advanced materials, science, and crude understanding of the forces that powered legendary Pokémon, they created containment systems that could suppress the Regis's abilities and lock them in dormant states. The sealing of Regigigas and its subordinates represented a significant turning point in the relationship between legendary Pokémon and intelligent life. Prior to this, legendaries had generally been viewed as natural forces that were beyond the influence of ordinary beings. The successful containment of such powerful Pokémon demonstrated that intelligence and technology could potentially overcome even cosmic-level powers, at least temporarily. However, the sealing also had unintended consequences for universal development. With the Regis locked away, the fine-tuning processes that maintained optimal planetary conditions gradually degraded. Continental drift resumed its random patterns. Erosion began wearing down carefully crafted geographical features, and the precise mineral distributions that supported diverse ecosystems began to shift toward less optimal configurations. These changes weren't immediately catastrophic, but they established a pattern that would recur throughout universal history, when legendary Pokémon were prevented from fulfilling their cosmic roles. The systems they maintained would slowly degrade, eventually requiring intervention from other legendaries or the development of new solutions by intelligent life forms. Meanwhile, in the cosmic depths far from these terrestrial concerns, another significant development was taking place. A meteor of unprecedented size and energy content was approaching the galaxy, carrying within it not just the power of mega evolution, but something far more dangerous. This meteor contained Eternatus, a Pokémon whose nature was so fundamentally alien to the universe's structure that its arrival would threaten the stability of entire regions of space. Eternatus hadn't been created by Arceus or emerged from natural universal processes. Instead, it was a fragment of something that existed before the current universe began, a remnant of whatever cosmic order had preceded Arceus's creation. Its energy signature was completely incompatible with the fundamental forces that governed reality, making its presence inherently destabilizing to local spacetime. As the meteor carrying Eternatus approached inhabited worlds, its influence began affecting the normal relationship between energy and matter. The phenomenon that would later be known as Dynamaxing began manifesting spontaneously, causing Pokémon and other life forms to grow to enormous sizes, while simultaneously becoming suffused with alien energy that enhanced their abilities far beyond normal limits. However, this Dynamax energy wasn't beneficial in the way that Mega Evolution energy had proven to be. While Mega Evolution temporarily restored Pokémon to forms more closely resembling their primordial states, Dynamaxing imposed an alien energy pattern that was fundamentally opposed to natural biological processes. Pokémon subjected to this influence became more powerful, but also increasingly unstable and difficult to control. The approach of Eternatus attracted the attention of two Pokémon who would later become central figures in the Galar region's mythology. Zacian and Zamazenta were warrior Pokémon who had evolved specifically to combat threats that conventional forces couldn't handle. Their abilities were designed around the concept of legendary Pokémon combat, making them uniquely qualified to face opponents whose power levels approached cosmic significance. Zacian possessed offensive capabilities that could cut through the defenses of even cosmic-level entities. Its blade wasn't made of ordinary matter, but was instead a manifestation of pure cutting force that could separate things on a conceptual level. This weapon could theoretically cut through space-time itself, though such extreme applications risked causing damage to universal structure that might be irreparable. Zamazenta's abilities were complementary, focused on defense and protection rather than offense. Its shield could block attacks from cosmic-level entities, absorbing and redirecting energy that would normally devastate entire planetary systems. More importantly, Zamazenta could extend its protective influence to cover other beings, allowing it to shield entire civilizations from attacks that they had no other means of surviving. When Eternatus's meteor finally made contact with a planetary surface, The impact released energies that threatened to destabilize the entire local region of space. The alien Pokemon's influence began spreading like an infection, converting normal matter and energy into forms that were compatible with its pre-universal origins, but incompatible with current reality structure. The battle between Eternatus and the warrior Pokémon duo lasted for extended periods that strained the local flow of time itself. Eternatus's power seemed limitless, drawing energy from sources that existed outside normal space-time, and therefore couldn't be depleted by conventional means. Zacian's attacks, while capable of inflicting damage on the alien entity, couldn't seem to strike at whatever core essence maintained its existence. The turning point came when Zamazenta realized that defeating Eternatus might not be possible, but containing it could be achieved. Using its shield to create a stable energy field around the alien Pokémon, Zamazenta began the process of creating a containment system that could isolate Eternatus's influence from the surrounding space-time. However, this containment required a permanent commitment from both warrior Pokémon. Zacian had to continuously cut away the alien energy that Eternatus constantly radiated, while Zamazenta had to maintain the shield barrier that prevented this energy from affecting the outside universe. The two Pokémon entered a state of eternal vigilance, forever locked in combat with an enemy whose defeat was impossible, but whose containment was essential for universal stability. The successful containment of Eternatus marked the end of the cosmic shaping period and the beginning of more localized legendary Pokémon activity. The basic structure of the universe was complete, with stable worlds capable of supporting diverse life forms distributed throughout the cosmos. The fundamental forces were balanced. The capacity for consciousness was embedded in reality's structure, and the various Pokémon responsible for maintaining cosmic order were either fulfilling their roles or safely contained. However, the events of this period had established several important precedents that would influence all future legendary Pokémon activity. The conflicts between opposing forces like Kyogre and Groudon had demonstrated that legendary Pokémon could pose threats to universal stability when their roles brought them into conflict. The successful mediation by Rayquaza showed that such conflicts could be resolved without permanent damage to either party. The sealing of the Regis proved that intelligent civilizations could develop technologies capable of containing even cosmic-level Pokémon powers, though often at significant cost to universal maintenance systems. Most importantly, the arrival and containment of Eternatus revealed that the universe faced threats from beyond its own structure, remnants of previous cosmic orders that were fundamentally incompatible with current reality. This knowledge would become crucial in later eras when other extra-universal entities attempted to influence or invade the established cosmic order. As this age of cosmic construction drew to a close, the universe had been transformed from a simple framework of time, space, and consciousness into a complex system of diverse worlds, each capable of supporting the evolution of life forms whose complexity would eventually rival that of the legendary Pokémon themselves. The stage was set for the next phase of universal development, when the first intelligent civilizations would begin to emerge and establish their own relationships with the cosmic forces that had shaped their worlds. As the cosmic construction phase reached its conclusion and stable worlds began supporting complex ecosystems, the universe entered a new era characterized by the emergence of intelligence and civilization. The genetic patterns that Mew had established were finally expressing themselves in forms capable of abstract thought, technological development, and cultural complexity. However, this transition from purely natural processes to intelligence-driven change introduced unprecedented challenges that would require new forms of legendary Pokémon intervention. The first intelligent species to develop beyond simple tool use appeared on worlds that had benefited from optimal geological engineering by Regigigas and its subordinates. These early civilizations found themselves inhabiting planets with unusually favorable conditions for technological development. Abundant mineral resources, conveniently located near population centers, and geographical features that naturally encouraged trade and cultural exchange between different groups. Initially, these developing civilizations had little direct contact with legendary Pokémon. The cosmic-scale entities like Dialga, Palkia, and the Lake Guardians operated on levels of reality that were largely invisible to ordinary consciousness. while the world-shaping Pokémon like Kyogre and Groudon had completed most of their active construction work and entered periods of dormancy in remote locations. The sealed Regis remained locked away by the sealing technologies of previous civilizations, their locations lost to historical records. However, as these early societies grew more sophisticated and began developing their own relationships with the Pokémon species that shared their worlds, they inevitably encountered legendary Pokémon, whose roles brought them into direct contact with intelligent life. The first such encounters established patterns of interaction that would influence relationships between legendaries and civilizations throughout subsequent universal history. Among the earliest legendary Pokémon to establish regular contact with developing civilizations were Latios and Latias, twin Pokémon whose abilities and temperament made them natural guardians and guides for intelligent species. These Pokémon had emerged during the period when Arceus was establishing the fundamental forces of consciousness, but their role was more specific than the cosmic influence of the Lake Guardians. Where Uxie, Mesprit, and Azelf worked to embed the capacity for knowledge, emotion, and will into the basic structure of consciousness itself, Latios and Latias were designed to provide more direct assistance to civilizations that had already developed these capacities. Latios embodied the protective aspect of intelligence, using its psychic abilities to shield developing civilizations from threats they weren't yet equipped to handle independently. This Pokémon could detect hostile intentions from vast distances, whether from dangerous wild Pokémon, natural disasters, or conflicts between different groups within a civilization. Its invisibility abilities allowed it to observe situations without interfering unnecessarily, intervening only when circumstances threatened to overwhelm a civilization's ability to cope. The Pokémon's most remarkable ability was its capacity for empathic communication with intelligent beings. Unlike the telepathic influence of other psychic legendaries, which could be overwhelming or incomprehensible to ordinary minds, Latios could communicate in ways that felt natural and non-intrusive to its recipients. This allowed it to provide guidance and warnings that civilizations could understand and act upon without feeling that their autonomy was being compromised. Latias complemented its counterpart by embodying the nurturing aspect of intelligence, using its abilities to help civilizations develop their emotional and social capacities. This Pokémon had an innate understanding of the psychological needs that intelligent beings required for healthy development, both as individuals and as societies. It could sense when communities were under stress from internal conflicts, resource shortages, or cultural transitions, and could provide subtle assistance that helped them navigate these challenges successfully. Both Pokémon possessed the ability to transform their appearance, taking on human-like forms that allowed them to interact more directly with the civilizations they protected. This shape-shifting wasn't mere illusion, but involved temporarily restructuring their cellular composition to create genuinely functional alternative bodies. In these forms, they could serve as teachers, advisors, or even friends to individuals who needed guidance or support. The relationship between these twin Pokémon and early civilizations established several important principles that would influence legendary Pokémon interactions throughout history. Most significantly, they demonstrated that legendary Pokémon could work with intelligent species as partners rather than simply as distant cosmic forces. Their interventions were collaborative rather than dictatorial, providing assistance and guidance while respecting the autonomy and decision-making capacity of the civilizations they aided. However, this close relationship also created vulnerabilities that would later be exploited by less benevolent forces. The emotional bonds that Latios and Latias formed with human communities made them protective to the point of self-sacrifice, willing to expend their own vital energy to save civilizations they had grown to care about. This protective instinct, while admirable, sometimes led them to take risks that endangered their own continued existence. As civilizations continued developing and began exploring beyond their homeworlds, they encountered another legendary Pokémon, whose role would become crucial for the continued expansion of intelligent life throughout the universe. Jirachi represented a unique approach to legendary Pokémon design, embodying the concept of wish fulfillment in a way that could provide civilizations with solutions to problems they couldn't solve through their own efforts alone. Jirachi's awakening cycle was tied to astronomical events that occurred roughly once every 1,000 years, though the exact timing varied depending on the specific cosmic alignments in each planetary system. During its active periods, this Pokémon could manipulate probability and causality in ways that made seemingly impossible outcomes achievable. However, these abilities came with strict limitations that prevented them from being used carelessly or harmfully. The most important restriction on Jirachi's power was that it could only fulfill wishes that were genuinely beneficial for long-term universal stability. The Pokémon possessed an intuitive understanding of the complex causal networks that connected events across cosmic scales, allowing it to recognize when granting a particular wish would create problems that outweighed any immediate benefits. This cosmic perspective meant that many requests were denied, not out of malice, but because fulfilling them would ultimately harm the very civilizations making the requests. When Jirachi did grant wishes, the results often came about through chains of seemingly coincidental events rather than direct miraculous interventions. A civilization facing extinction from resource depletion might find that Jirachi's influence led to the discovery of new resource deposits, the development of more efficient technologies, or contact with other civilizations willing to provide assistance. These solutions appeared natural and achievable, maintaining the sense that the civilization had solved its own problems rather than becoming dependent on legendary Pokémon intervention. The 1,000-year awakening cycle served several important functions beyond simply limiting the frequency of wish granting. During its dormant periods, Jirachi's consciousness expanded to cosmic scales, allowing it to monitor the long-term consequences of its previous interventions and adjust its understanding of what constitutes beneficial outcomes. This extended perspective was essential for ensuring that wish fulfillment didn't create unintended negative consequences that only became apparent over longer timescales. The Pokémon's dormancy also prevented civilizations from becoming overly dependent on wish fulfillment as a solution to their problems. The knowledge that Jirachi would be unavailable for centuries at a time encouraged societies to develop their own problem-solving capabilities and to use wished-for solutions as supplements to their own efforts rather than replacements for them. As spacefaring civilizations began establishing settlements throughout the galaxy, they occasionally encountered remnants of the cosmic construction period that posed ongoing threats to universal stability. One such encounter involved Deoxys, a Pokémon whose origins lay in the intersection of cosmic forces and viral evolution. This entity had formed when a space-dwelling virus was exposed to the intense energies present during the early universe's formation, transforming it into something that transcended the normal boundaries between organic and cosmic phenomena. Deoxys represented both tremendous opportunity and significant danger for developing civilizations. Its ability to rapidly alter its cellular structure and adapt to new environments made it potentially valuable as a source of biological and technological insights. The Pokémon's crystalline core contained information about cosmic processes that most civilizations wouldn't discover through their own research for thousands of years. Its various forms demonstrated principles of matter manipulation and energy conversion that could revolutionize how intelligent species understood their universe. However, Deoxys's viral origins also made it inherently unpredictable and potentially dangerous. The Pokémon's psychological makeup was fundamentally different from other legendary Pokémon, shaped by evolutionary pressures that emphasized rapid adaptation and competitive survival rather than cosmic balance or cooperation with other species. Its intelligence was vast but alien, operating according to logic patterns that could be incomprehensible or even threatening to more conventionally evolved minds. The encounters between Deoxys and early spacefaring civilizations often followed a similar pattern. Initial contact would reveal the Pokémon's incredible scientific value, leading to attempts at communication and collaboration. However, as the relationship developed, Deoxys's alien psychology would begin manifesting in ways that created conflict. The Pokémon might attempt to optimize the civilization's biological processes according to its own viral logic, or it might interpret defensive actions as evolutionary challenges that required aggressive responses. These conflicts eventually attracted the attention of Rayquaza, whose role as cosmic mediator extended to managing threats that endangered the stability of developing civilizations. The battles between Rayquaza and Deoxys became legendary throughout early spacefaring cultures, representing the eternal struggle between the forces of stability and uncontrolled change that would characterize much of universal history. However, these conflicts weren't simply destructive clashes between opposing forces. Each battle served as a learning experience for both Pokémon, gradually teaching Deoxys how to interact with other forms of consciousness without triggering defensive responses, while helping Rayquaza understand how to manage entities whose alien psychology made conventional diplomatic approaches ineffective. As civilizations continued expanding and developing more sophisticated understanding of their universe, they began encountering legendary Pokémon, whose roles involved the fundamental aspects of consciousness itself. The most significant of these encounters involved the forces that governed the boundary between sleep and waking, dreams and reality. This boundary had been established during the universe's early development as part of the consciousness-enabling infrastructure, but its maintenance required ongoing attention from specialized Pokémon. Cresselia emerged as the guardian of beneficial sleep and positive dreams, ensuring that intelligent beings could access the restorative and creative aspects of unconscious mental processes without being overwhelmed by the chaotic psychological forces that existed in the depths of consciousness. This Pokémon's influence extended beyond simple sleep regulation to encompass the broader relationship between conscious and unconscious mental processes that was essential for healthy psychological development. The Pokémon's abilities included the capacity to enter and navigate dream states, providing protection and guidance to sleeping minds that were vulnerable to various forms of psychological attack or manipulation. Cresselia could eliminate nightmares, heal trauma-related sleep disorders, and even facilitate prophetic dreams that provided civilizations with valuable insights about future challenges or opportunities. However, the existence of beneficial dream influence necessarily implied the possibility of harmful dream manipulation, and this darker aspect of sleep psychology was embodied by Darkrai. This Pokémon represented the chaotic, destructive forces that could emerge from unconscious mental processes when they weren't properly balanced by conscious awareness. Darkrai's influence could trap minds in eternal nightmares, exploit psychological vulnerabilities to cause lasting mental damage, and even use dream states as gateways for attacks on waking consciousness. The relationship between Cresselia and Darkrai was more complex than simple opposition. Both Pokémon served essential functions in maintaining psychological health among intelligent beings. Cresselia's protective influence was necessary for preventing harmful dream experiences, but it could become overprotective if not balanced by the challenges and growth opportunities that Darkrai's influence provided. Similarly, while Darkrai's nightmares could be traumatic and destructive, they also served important functions in helping minds process difficult experiences and develop resilience against psychological threats. The key to maintaining healthy psychological development in intelligent civilizations lay in ensuring that both Pokémon's influences remained balanced. Communities that experienced only Cresselia's beneficial dreams might become psychologically stagnant, unable to confront difficult truths or develop the emotional strength needed to handle challenging situations. Conversely, populations subjected primarily to Darkrai's nightmares could become paralyzed by fear and anxiety, unable to take the risks necessary for continued growth and development. Early civilizations that encountered these Pokémon often struggled to understand their complementary nature, attempting to suppress Darkrai's influence entirely while maximizing access to Cresselia's benefits. This approach typically backfired, creating psychological imbalances that made communities more vulnerable to exactly the kinds of harmful influences they were trying to avoid. The successful integration of both dream Pokémon into civilization required developing sophisticated understanding of psychology and consciousness that many early cultures weren't equipped to handle. This need drove significant advances in philosophical and scientific thinking about the nature of mind and consciousness, contributing to the intellectual development that would eventually enable civilizations to understand their relationship with other legendary Pokémon as well. As civilizations continued expanding and exploring their universe, they encountered legendary Pokémon whose roles were tied to specific planetary environments and geological processes. Among the most significant of these was Heatran, a Pokémon whose domain encompassed volcanic activity and the deep geological processes that maintained planetary stability over cosmic timescales. Heatran had emerged during the period when Groudon was establishing the basic geological structures of planetary systems, but its role was more specialized and localized than the continent-building activities of its cosmic predecessor. This Pokémon served as a guardian and regulator of volcanic processes, ensuring that the tremendous energies involved in magma formation and eruption were channeled in ways that supported rather than threatened the ecosystems that had developed on planetary surfaces. The Pokémon's relationship with volcanic activity was sophisticated and multifaceted. While it could trigger eruptions when necessary to relieve dangerous pressure buildups or to create new land formations, it more commonly worked to prevent unnecessary volcanic activity that might damage established ecosystems. Heatran's influence could redirect magma flows away from populated areas, moderate the intensity of eruptions to reduce their destructive potential, and even accelerate the cooling and soil formation processes that made volcanic regions habitable for other species. However, Heatran's role extended beyond simple volcanic management to encompass the broader relationship between geological stability and biological diversity. Volcanic regions often became centers of evolutionary innovation due to their unique environmental conditions and mineral compositions, and Heatran's influence helped optimize these conditions for maximum biological creativity, while minimizing the risks that made volcanic environments dangerous for most life forms. The Pokémon's presence in a region typically indicated that significant geological processes were ongoing or planned for the future. Civilizations that encountered Heatran learned to interpret its activities as signals about long-term geological trends that would affect their settlement and development plans. This predictive capability made Heatran valuable to spacefaring cultures that were evaluating potential colony sites, though direct communication with the Pokémon required careful attention to safety protocols due to the extreme temperatures and pressures in its preferred habitats. Complementing Heatran's geological focus, another legendary Pokémon emerged whose role centered on the biological processes that transformed raw geological environments into flourishing ecosystems. Shaymin represented the forces of growth, renewal, and ecological recovery that were essential for maintaining the biological diversity that had developed from Mew's genetic template. In its land form, Shaymin appeared as a small, hedgehog-like Pokémon whose unassuming appearance concealed remarkable abilities related to plant growth and environmental restoration. The Pokémon could accelerate photosynthesis, enhance soil fertility, and even purify contaminated environments by processing toxins through specialized biological pathways that converted harmful substances into nutrients that could support healthy plant growth. These abilities made Shaymin particularly valuable to civilizations that were recovering from environmental disasters or attempting to establish sustainable settlements in challenging environments. The Pokémon's influence could restore damaged ecosystems to full productivity in time frames that would normally require centuries of natural recovery processes, allowing civilizations to repair environmental damage caused by industrial activities or natural catastrophes. However, Shaymin's most remarkable capability was its ability to transform into a sky form that possessed entirely different abilities focused on atmospheric processes rather than terrestrial plant growth. This transformation was triggered by exposure to Grace Idea flowers, plants that had co-evolved with Shaymin to serve as catalysts for its metamorphosis. In sky form, Shaymin could purify atmospheric contamination, regulate weather patterns to support optimal growing conditions, and even travel through dimensional barriers to bring its restorative influence to locations that were otherwise inaccessible. The dual nature of Shaymin's abilities reflected a broader principle that was becoming apparent in the legendary Pokémon that emerged during this period of universal development. As the cosmos grew more complex, and civilizations began creating their own environmental impacts, legendary Pokémon were evolving more sophisticated and flexible capabilities that allowed them to address multiple related challenges rather than focusing on single cosmic functions. This evolution in legendary Pokémon capabilities was driven by the increasing complexity of the problems that required their intervention. Early cosmic construction had involved relatively straightforward challenges, like establishing basic physical laws or creating planetary structures. However, the emergence of intelligent civilizations created new categories of problems that crossed traditional boundaries between geological, biological, psychological, and technological domains. The legendary Pokémon that emerged during this period demonstrated increasing specialization in handling these complex, multidimensional challenges. Their abilities were designed not just to address immediate problems, but to provide civilizations with the tools and knowledge needed to prevent similar problems from recurring in the future. This educational aspect of legendary Pokémon intervention became increasingly important as civilizations developed technologies that could potentially rival legendary Pokémon powers in their capacity for both beneficial and harmful effects. The legendary Pokémon of this era served not just as protectors and problem solvers, but as teachers and guides helping intelligent species learn to use their growing capabilities responsibly. The relationships established during this period between legendary Pokémon and early civilizations created precedents that would influence all subsequent interactions between cosmic forces and intelligent life. The collaborative approach pioneered by Latios and Latias, the educational methodology demonstrated by Jirachi's wish-granting protocols, and the balanced intervention strategies developed by Cresselia and Darkrai all became models for how legendary Pokémon could work with, rather than simply for intelligent civilizations. However, these relationships also revealed potential vulnerabilities in both legendary Pokémon and the civilizations they served. The emotional bonds formed between guardians and their charges could be exploited by hostile forces, while the dependence that civilizations might develop on legendary Pokémon assistance could undermine their capacity for independent problem-solving and growth. As this period of early civilization development drew to a close, the universe had evolved from a cosmos of purely natural processes into a complex system where intelligence, technology, and cosmic forces interacted in increasingly sophisticated ways. The foundations had been laid for the more complex relationships between legendary Pokémon and advanced civilizations that would characterize the next phase of universal history, when the first technological civilizations would begin developing capabilities that approached legendary Pokémon power levels themselves. The stage was set for conflicts and collaborations that would test whether the partnership model established during this era could survive the challenges posed by civilizations whose ambitions extended to reshaping the cosmic order itself, and whether legendary Pokémon could continue serving as guardians and guides for species whose technological capabilities made them potential rivals, rather than simply charges to be protected. As civilizations matured and spread across multiple worlds, their increasing technological capabilities began creating environmental impacts that required more direct intervention from legendary Pokémon. The collaborative relationships established in the previous era had been successful when dealing with localized problems or providing guidance to developing societies, but the scale of change that advanced civilizations could produce demanded a different approach to legendary Pokémon involvement in planetary management. The need for more active legendary Pokémon intervention became apparent first in regions where multiple advanced civilizations had established themselves in proximity to each other. Competition for resources, territorial disputes, and the cumulative effects of industrial development created environmental stresses that exceeded the capacity of individual Pokémon like Heatran or Shaymin to address through their specialized abilities alone. What was needed were legendary Pokémon whose roles encompassed broader elemental forces and who could coordinate their efforts to maintain stability across entire planetary systems. The first legendary Pokémon to emerge in response to this need were the three elemental birds that would become central to the mythology of what later civilizations would know as the Kanto region. However, their initial manifestation extended far beyond any single planetary system, representing a universal response to the challenge of maintaining elemental balance in the face of increasingly sophisticated technological interference with natural processes. Articuno emerged as the embodiment of ice, cold, and the preservative forces that maintained stability in natural systems. This Pokemon's role extended beyond simple temperature control to encompass the broader principles of conservation and equilibrium that were essential for preventing runaway changes in planetary environments. Articuno's influence could slow down or halt destructive processes, preserve endangered ecosystems in stable states until they could recover naturally, and create the kind of climatic stability that allowed diverse species to coexist without being overwhelmed by rapid environmental changes. The Pokemon's powers were most commonly manifested through weather control, particularly the ability to generate blizzards, ice storms, and sustained cold periods that could counteract the warming effects of industrial activity or natural climate fluctuations. However, Articuno's abilities extended to more subtle forms of intervention, including the capacity to accelerate the formation of glacial ice that could serve as long-term water storage, create permafrost layers that prevented soil erosion, and even induce hibernation states in biological systems that were under excessive stress. Articuno's personality reflected its elemental nature, characterized by a calm, patient approach to problem-solving that prioritized long-term stability over immediate dramatic interventions. This Pokemon would often observe developing environmental problems for extended periods before taking action, gathering comprehensive information about all the factors involved before implementing solutions that addressed root causes rather than simply treating symptoms. However, this measured approach sometimes created conflicts with the more immediate needs of civilizations facing environmental crises. Articuno's tendency to prioritize ecosystem stability over short-term human needs could result in interventions that, while beneficial in the long run, imposed significant hardships on populations that were already struggling with environmental challenges. Zapdos represented the opposite pole of elemental influence, embodying electricity, storms, and the dynamic forces that drove change and renewal in natural systems. Where Articuno sought to preserve and stabilize, Zapdos introduced the energy and disruption necessary to prevent stagnation and promote continued evolution and adaptation. This Pokemon's influence could restart stalled ecological processes, break up entrenched patterns that were preventing healthy development, and provide the energetic input necessary for biological systems to adapt to changing conditions. The Pokemon's electrical powers were manifestations of deeper abilities related to energy distribution and system activation. Zapdos could energize depleted ecosystems, restart biological processes that had been interrupted by environmental damage, and even stimulate evolutionary adaptations that helped species cope with rapidly changing environmental conditions. Its lightning storms weren't simply weather phenomena, but targeted interventions designed to redistribute energy in ways that supported overall system health. Zapdos's personality was as dynamic as its powers, characterized by a preference for direct action and immediate intervention when problems were detected. Unlike Articuno's careful deliberation, Zapdos would often act quickly to address emerging issues, even when the full scope of the situation wasn't yet clear. This approach sometimes led to overcorrections or interventions that created new problems while solving old ones. But it also prevented many situations from developing into more serious crises. The tension between Zapdos's preference for immediate action and Articuno's emphasis on careful planning created a natural opposition that helped balance their environmental interventions. Neither approach was optimal for all situations, but the interaction between their different methodologies typically resulted in more effective overall environmental management than either Pokemon could achieve working alone. Moltres completed this elemental trinity by embodying fire, renewal, and the transformative forces that enabled damaged systems to regenerate and rebuild. This Pokemon's role was particularly important in environments that had been severely damaged by industrial activity, natural disasters, or conflicts between different civilizations. Moltres possessed the ability to break down damaged ecological structures and recycle their components into forms that could support new, healthier ecosystem development. The Pokemon's fire-based powers were tools for controlled destruction and renewal, rather than simple combustion. Moltres could incinerate toxic pollutants, break down accumulated waste products that were interfering with natural processes, and clear away overgrown or diseased vegetation that was preventing healthy ecosystem development. However, these destructive processes were always coupled with regenerative influences that ensured that cleared areas would quickly be recolonized by appropriate species. Perhaps more importantly, Moltres could stimulate the regenerative capacities of biological systems themselves, enhancing natural healing processes and accelerating recovery from environmental damage. This Pokemon's influence could help forests regrow after deforestation, restore soil fertility after intensive agriculture, and even assist in the rehabilitation of species that had been severely reduced by environmental stresses. Moltres' personality combined aspects of both its elemental companions, demonstrating Zapdos' preference for decisive action when intervention was needed while maintaining Articuno's focus on long-term beneficial outcomes. However, this Pokémon was distinguished by an optimistic confidence in the capacity of natural systems to recover from even severe damage if provided with appropriate assistance. The three elemental birds were designed to work together as a coordinated system rather than as independent entities. Their elemental powers were complementary, with each Pokémon's abilities addressing different aspects of environmental management, while their combined influence created comprehensive solutions that no single Pokémon could achieve alone. However, this interdependence also created potential for conflict when their different approaches to problem-solving came into opposition. Such conflicts typically arose when environmental problems required interventions that involved elements controlled by multiple birds. A severely damaged ecosystem might need Moltres' regenerative fires to clear away accumulated damage, Zapdos' energizing influence to restart biological processes, and Articuno's stabilizing effects to maintain conditions suitable for recovery. Coordinating these different types of intervention required careful timing and mutual cooperation that wasn't always easy to achieve. When conflicts did arise between the elemental birds, their battles could have devastating effects on the very environments they were meant to protect. Articuno's ice could freeze Zapdos' electrical storms into destructive hail, while Zapdos' lightning could shatter Articuno's protective ice barriers and expose vulnerable ecosystems to temperature extremes. Moltres' fires could melt Articuno's stabilizing ice formations while being short-circuited by Zapdos' electrical discharges, creating steam explosions that damaged rather than renewed affected areas. These destructive conflicts between the elemental birds created a need for mediation that exceeded the capabilities of existing legendary Pokémon. Rayquaza's cosmic perspective made it effective at resolving conflicts between world-shaping entities like Kyogre and Groudon. But the elemental birds' disputes involved more subtle environmental management issues that required understanding of local ecological conditions rather than universal physical principles. The solution emerged from the oceanic depths where Kyogre had been resting since the completion of the cosmic construction phase. However, the Pokémon that arose to mediate the elemental birds' conflicts wasn't Kyogre itself, but a new legendary Pokémon whose abilities had been shaped by extended exposure to Kyogre's influence, combined with the complex environmental challenges that had developed since the establishment of advanced civilizations. Lugia emerged as a Pokémon uniquely suited to serve as mediator and coordinator for the elemental birds. This Pokémon possessed psychic abilities that allowed it to understand and communicate with the birds' different personalities and approaches to environmental management. More importantly, Lugia's powers included the capacity to moderate and redirect the elemental forces that the birds controlled, preventing their conflicts from causing environmental damage, while helping them coordinate their abilities for maximum beneficial effect. Lugia's relationship with the elemental birds wasn't based on superior power, though its abilities were formidable enough to restrain them when necessary. Instead, this Pokémon served as a facilitator and counselor, helping the birds understand how their different approaches could be combined productively rather than attempting to impose solutions from outside their elemental domains. The Pokémon's preferred habitat in oceanic depths served multiple functions beyond simple concealment from surface civilizations. The deep ocean provided Lugia with a neutral territory that wasn't directly controlled by any of the elemental birds, allowing it to maintain independence while monitoring their activities. The aquatic environment also offered unique perspectives on environmental management, demonstrating how different elements could coexist and interact productively within marine ecosystems. Lugia's psychic abilities were particularly well suited for environmental mediation because they operated on multiple levels simultaneously. The Pokémon could communicate directly with other legendary Pokémon to understand their perspectives and motivations, while also monitoring the environmental effects of their actions across entire planetary systems. This comprehensive awareness allowed Lugia to identify potential conflicts before they became destructive and to suggest alternative approaches that achieved each Pokémon's goals without interfering with the others' activities. However, Lugia's mediation role was complicated by the emergence of another legendary Pokémon whose approach to environmental management differed significantly from the elemental bird's focus on natural processes. Ho-Oh represented a more direct intervention strategy, using powers related to life and death to address environmental problems through biological manipulation rather than elemental control. Ho-Oh had emerged during the period when civilizations were beginning to cause species extinctions through habitat destruction, overhunting, and pollution. This Pokémon's abilities were specifically designed to counteract these threats to biological diversity by restoring extinct species, enhancing the survival capabilities of endangered populations, and even creating new species that could thrive in environments that had been altered by civilization activity. The Pokémon's most remarkable power was its ability to resurrect recently extinct species, provided that some trace of their biological essence remained available. This wasn't simple reanimation, but genuine restoration that brought species back to full vitality, with all their original capabilities intact. However, these resurrections often resulted in species that were subtly different from their original forms, enhanced with additional capabilities that helped them survive in environments that had been altered since their extinction. Ho-Oh's life-granting powers extended beyond simple resurrection to encompass broader forms of biological enhancement and adaptation. This Pokémon could accelerate evolutionary processes to help species adapt more quickly to changing environmental conditions, enhance the reproductive success of endangered populations, and even facilitate the development of symbiotic relationships between species that allowed them to support each other's survival in challenging environments. The Pokémon's radiant appearance and association with beneficial outcomes made it generally popular with civilizations that encountered it. Unlike the elemental birds, whose interventions sometimes imposed hardships or required sacrifices from affected populations, Ho-Oh's activities typically resulted in immediate, visible improvements to biological diversity and ecosystem health. However, Ho-Oh's approach to environmental management sometimes conflicted with the more gradual, process-oriented methods favored by the elemental birds. The Pokémon's tendency to intervene directly in biological systems could disrupt the careful balance of elemental forces that Articuno, Zapdos, and Moltres worked to maintain. Enhanced species might consume resources faster than ecosystems could regenerate them, or newly created species might outcompete existing ones in ways that reduced rather than increased overall biological diversity. These conflicts came to a head in one of the most significant legendary Pokémon incidents of this era, centered around the city that would later be known as Ecruteak in the Johto region. This settlement had grown up around a pair of towers that served as focal points for Ho-Oh's activities and as symbols of the civilization's partnership with the legendary Pokémon. The towers represented different aspects of Ho-Oh's powers, with one dedicated to the Pokémon's life-giving abilities and the other to its capacity for renewal and transformation. The taller of these structures, known as the Bell Tower, served as Ho-Oh's primary roost and as a center for ceremonies celebrating the Pokémon's life-enhancing interventions. The tower's bells could be heard across vast distances, serving as a signal that Ho-Oh was present and available to assist with biological emergencies or evolutionary challenges. The tower itself was constructed using materials that had been enhanced by Ho-Oh's influence, making it more durable and beautiful than conventional architecture could achieve. The second structure, called the Brass Tower, was dedicated to Ho-Oh's transformative powers and served as a repository for the biological specimens that the Pokémon used in its resurrection and enhancement work. This tower contained preservation chambers, research facilities, and living quarters for the scientists and scholars who worked with Ho-Oh to understand and optimize its biological interventions. However, the concentration of Ho-Oh's activities around these towers created environmental imbalances that attracted the attention of the elemental birds. The rapid biological changes that Ho-Oh's presence enabled were consuming resources and energy at rates that exceeded the natural regenerative capacity of the surrounding ecosystem. Zapdos detected electrical field fluctuations caused by the accelerated biological activity, while Articuno noted that the region's temperature patterns were becoming unstable due to the metabolic heat generated by enhanced organisms. Moltres' concerns were more specific and immediate. The Pokémon detected that the accelerated biological processes occurring around the towers were generating waste products and metabolic byproducts that could become toxic if they continued accumulating. The natural recycling processes that would normally break down these materials were being overwhelmed by the sheer volume of biological activity that Ho-Oh's presence had stimulated. When the elemental birds attempted to intervene to restore balance to the region, their efforts conflicted with Ho-Oh's ongoing biological enhancement projects. Articuno's cooling influence slowed down the metabolic processes that Ho-Oh was trying to accelerate, while Zapdos's electrical storms interfered with the delicate biological manipulations that were in progress. Moltres' purifying fires threatened to destroy the very biological diversity that Ho-Oh was working to protect and enhance. The resulting conflict between Ho-Oh and the elemental birds created environmental chaos throughout the region. Weather patterns became erratic as Articuno and Zapdos's opposing influences clashed in the atmosphere above the city. Biological systems fluctuated wildly between enhancement and stress as Ho-Oh's life-giving powers competed with Moltres' purifying influences. The very landscape around the towers began showing signs of instability as different legendary Pokémon powers pulled the environment in incompatible directions. The crisis reached its peak when the conflicting legendary Pokémon powers created a resonance effect that destabilized the brass tower's structural integrity. The building's enhanced materials, while more durable than normal construction materials, weren't designed to withstand the kind of elemental chaos that was occurring around them. The tower's foundations began to crack as Articuno's ice formation competed with Moltres' heating effects, while Zapdos's electrical discharges interfered with the magnetic fields that Ho-Oh used to maintain the tower's structural enhancements. The tower's collapse was sudden and catastrophic. The building's destruction scattered the biological specimens and research materials that had been stored within it, while the fires that resulted from the collapse began spreading throughout the city. However, the most tragic aspect of the disaster was the fate of 3 Pokémon that had been residing within the tower as part of Ho-Oh's biological research projects. These 3 Pokémon had been subjects of Ho-Oh's enhancement experiments, undergoing gradual biological modifications that were intended to give them capabilities that would allow them to serve as guardians for other enhanced species. The process was still incomplete when the tower collapsed, leaving them trapped within the burning structure with no means of escape. The 3 Pokémon perished in the flames, their deaths representing a failure of Ho-Oh's protective abilities that had profound psychological effects on the legendary Pokémon. Ho-Oh had never before lost organisms that had been placed under its direct protection, and the experience of being unable to prevent these deaths challenged its fundamental understanding of its role in the universal order. However, the tragedy also provided Ho-Oh with an opportunity to demonstrate the full extent of its life-granting powers. The 3 deceased Pokémon had been so thoroughly integrated into Ho-Oh's biological enhancement programs that traces of their life essence remained connected to the legendary Pokémon even after their physical deaths. Using these connections, Ho-Oh was able to perform the most complex resurrection it had ever attempted, bringing the 3 Pokémon back to life in entirely new forms that incorporated the enhancements they had been undergoing at the time of their deaths. The resurrected Pokémon emerged as Entei, Raikou, and Suicune, each embodying different aspects of the elemental forces that had been involved in their deaths, while retaining the enhanced capabilities that Ho-Oh's experiments had been intended to provide. Entei incorporated the fire that had claimed their original lives, transforming it from a destructive force into a source of power and renewal. Raikou channeled the electrical energies that had contributed to the tower's structural failure, converting them into abilities that could protect rather than destroy. Suicune embodied the purification processes that could have prevented the toxic accumulations that had made the tower's environment unstable in the first place. These three resurrected Pokémon represented a new category of legendary Pokémon, beings whose abilities were derived not from direct cosmic forces or natural processes, but from the intersection of legendary Pokémon powers with the experiences of ordinary Pokémon who had been caught in the conflicts between cosmic entities. Their powers were more accessible to non-legendary Pokémon and could serve as bridges between the cosmic scale abilities of traditional legendaries and the more limited but flexible capabilities of ordinary species. However, the circumstances of their resurrection also created complications that would influence their relationships with both legendary Pokémon and ordinary civilizations. The three beasts retained memories of their deaths and of the conflicts between legendary Pokémon that had caused the tragedy. This knowledge made them wary of becoming too closely involved with either cosmic entities or civilizations, preferring to maintain independence that would allow them to avoid being caught in similar conflicts in the future. Their wariness was reinforced by the reaction of the Akrutake population to their resurrection. While Ho-Oh had intended the restored Pokémon as gifts to compensate the city for the tragedy that had befallen it, the human population viewed the three beasts with suspicion and fear. Their unusual origins and the circumstances of their creation made them seem unnatural and potentially dangerous, despite their actually benevolent intentions and capabilities. The rejection by the very civilization that Ho-Oh had been trying to help deepened the legendary Pokémon's disillusionment with direct intervention strategies. The failure to prevent the original tragedy, combined with the negative reception of its attempt to make amends, convinced Ho-Oh that its approach to environmental management needed to be reconsidered. This period of reflection was facilitated by Lugia, whose mediation role extended to helping other legendary Pokémon process the psychological effects of their interventions and adapt their approaches based on experience. Lugia's guidance helped Ho-Oh understand that its life-granting powers were most effective when used in coordination with other legendary Pokémon, rather than as independent interventions that ignored broader environmental considerations. The collaboration that developed between Ho-Oh and the elemental birds, mediated by Lugia, established new protocols for legendary Pokémon intervention that would influence environmental management throughout the universe. These protocols emphasized communication and coordination between different legendary Pokémon before major interventions, consideration of long-term environmental effects rather than just immediate beneficial outcomes, and respect for the autonomy and decision-making capabilities of the civilizations that were being assisted. However, the implementation of these new protocols was complicated by the emergence of another legendary Pokémon, whose role involved aspects of time and environmental management that intersected with the activities of all the other legendaries involved in planetary stewardship. Celebi represented the forces of temporal ecology, ensuring that environmental changes occurred at rates and in ways that maintained continuity with past conditions, while allowing for beneficial adaptation to future challenges. Celebi's time travel abilities weren't simply mechanisms for moving between different historical periods, but tools for environmental management that operated across temporal as well as spatial scales. This Pokémon could monitor the long-term consequences of environmental changes, bringing information about future outcomes back to inform present decisions. It could also intervene in past events to prevent environmental disasters, or to ensure that beneficial adaptations had the historical foundation necessary for success. The Pokémon's relationship with plant life and forest ecosystems reflected its temporal perspective on environmental management. Forests represented the longest-term biological processes on most planets, with individual trees living for centuries and forest ecosystems maintaining continuity across millennia. Celebi's influence could accelerate forest recovery after damage, ensure that forest ecosystems adapted appropriately to changing conditions, and even facilitate communication between plants across different time periods. However, Celebi's temporal abilities also created potential for conflicts with other legendary Pokémon, whose interventions could have unintended consequences when viewed from long-term temporal perspectives. Environmental changes that appeared beneficial in the short term might prove problematic when their cumulative effects developed over centuries or millennia. Similarly, interventions that seemed necessary based on current conditions might prove counterproductive if they interfered with natural adaptation processes that were still in development. The integration of Celebi into the collaborative environmental management system that was developing around Lugia's mediation required establishing protocols for temporal intervention that respected the autonomy of other legendary Pokémon while ensuring that their activities didn't create long-term problems that would require future correction. This balance was difficult to achieve, since temporal intervention necessarily involved some degree of constraint on present decisions based on knowledge of future outcomes. The solution that emerged involved treating Celebi as an advisor and information source rather than as a direct decision-maker in environmental management. The Pokémon would share information about long-term consequences and historical patterns, but the actual decisions about interventions would remain with the legendary Pokémon, whose domains were directly involved. This approach preserved the autonomy and expertise of specialized environmental managers, while ensuring that their decisions were informed by temporal perspective. The collaborative system that developed during this era represented a major evolution in legendary Pokémon organization and effectiveness. Rather than operating as independent entities whose activities might conflict or interfere with each other, the environmental management legendaries had learned to function as a coordinated network that could address complex, multifaceted environmental challenges with unprecedented effectiveness. However, the success of this collaboration also created new challenges related to the relationship between legendary Pokémon and the civilizations they served. The coordinated legendary Pokémon network was capable of environmental interventions on scales that could reshape entire planetary systems, potentially overriding the preferences and decisions of the civilizations that inhabited those systems. The balance between environmental stewardship and respect for civilization, autonomy, would become increasingly important as technological civilizations continued developing capabilities that could rival legendary Pokémon powers. The collaborative protocols developed during this era would be tested by future conflicts between environmental necessity and civilizational ambition, forcing both legendary Pokémon and intelligent species to grapple with questions about the limits of intervention and the nature of responsibility in a universe where multiple forms of cosmic-scale power coexisted. As this era of elemental balance drew to a close, the foundations had been established for more complex forms of legendary Pokémon organization and intervention. The principles of coordination, communication, and respect for long-term consequences would influence all subsequent legendary Pokémon activities, while the techniques for managing conflicts between different approaches to environmental stewardship would prove essential for maintaining universal stability as the cosmos continued evolving toward ever greater complexity. As civilizations reached new heights of technological and philosophical sophistication, their capacity for both creation and destruction began approaching levels that could affect entire planetary systems. The collaborative environmental management systems established by the legendary Pokémon in the previous era were effective at maintaining ecological balance, but they weren't designed to handle the more complex challenges that arose when advanced civilizations began grappling with fundamental questions about governance, ethics, and the nature of truth itself. The most significant of these challenges emerged in a region that would later be known as Unova, where two highly advanced civilizations had developed in close proximity to each other. Both societies had achieved remarkable technological capabilities and had established sophisticated philosophical traditions. But their approaches to understanding reality and organizing society were fundamentally incompatible. This incompatibility created tensions that would eventually reshape the legendary Pokémon landscape and establish new precedents for how cosmic forces responded to ideological conflicts. The first of these civilizations had built its entire culture around the pursuit of truth through empirical investigation and rational analysis. Their philosophers and scientists believed that reality had an objective structure that could be discovered through careful observation and logical reasoning. Their political systems emphasized transparency, evidence-based decision-making, and the continuous refinement of laws and policies based on new information about their effectiveness. This civilization's technological development reflected their philosophical commitments. Their machines were designed for precision and accuracy. Their cities were planned according to mathematical principles that optimized efficiency and functionality, and their educational systems focused on developing analytical skills and critical thinking capabilities. They viewed themselves as servants of truth, committed to discovering and implementing the most accurate possible understanding of how the universe actually functioned. The second civilization had developed along entirely different lines, building their culture around the power of ideals, imagination, and visionary thinking. Their philosophers and artists believed that reality was fundamentally shaped by consciousness and will, and that the most important truths were those that inspired people to transcend their current limitations and achieve higher forms of existence. Their political systems emphasized charismatic leadership, inspirational goals, and the mobilization of collective effort toward ambitious projects that might seem impossible but could be achieved through sufficient dedication and creativity. This civilization's technological capabilities were equally impressive, but reflected their different philosophical orientation. Their machines incorporated artistic elements and symbolic representations. Their cities were designed to inspire awe and promote social cohesion, and their educational systems focused on developing creative vision and the ability to motivate others toward shared goals. They viewed themselves as servants of idealism, committed to creating the most inspiring and transformative possible vision of what the universe could become. For centuries, these two civilizations coexisted peacefully, despite their philosophical differences. Their territories were separated by geographical barriers that limited direct contact, and when interactions did occur, the differences in their approaches often proved complementary rather than competitive. The truth-seeking civilization's precision and accuracy helped solve practical problems that the idealistic civilization struggled with, while the idealistic civilization's creativity and vision provided solutions to challenges that purely rational approaches couldn't address. However, as both civilizations continued developing and began expanding beyond their original territories, their different approaches to understanding reality began creating more serious conflicts. Disputes over resource allocation, territorial boundaries, and environmental management revealed that their philosophical differences weren't simply abstract intellectual matters, but had practical implications that affected how they interacted with the world around them. The crisis that would transform the region began when both civilizations discovered evidence of an ancient dragon, Pokémon, whose power exceeded anything in their previous experience. This entity had existed since the early periods of planetary development, serving as a guardian and coordinator for the various forces that maintained regional stability. However, the dragon had remained dormant for millennia, its presence known only through geological evidence and fragmentary historical records. The discovery of this ancient Pokémon represented different things to each civilization. The truth-seeking society viewed it as an opportunity to gain unprecedented insight into the fundamental forces that governed their world. They wanted to study the dragon scientifically, to understand its abilities and incorporate that knowledge into their existing body of empirical understanding. Their goal was to learn the truth about how legendary Pokémon powers actually functioned and to use that knowledge to benefit their civilization. The idealistic civilization saw the dragon as validation of their belief in the power of vision and aspiration to transform reality. They interpreted its legendary status as evidence that sufficient dedication and inspiration could elevate any being to cosmic significance. Their goal was to establish a partnership with the dragon that would enable their civilization to achieve the ambitious transformation projects that had long been central to their cultural identity. The conflict escalated when representatives of both civilizations approached the dragon simultaneously, each expecting it to respond favorably to their particular philosophical approach. However, the dragon's response revealed that it embodied aspects of both truth-seeking and idealistic approaches, rather than favoring either one exclusively. Its power derived from the integration of accurate understanding with visionary aspiration, requiring both precise knowledge of how things actually functioned and inspiring ideas about how they could be improved. This revelation created a crisis for both civilizations. The truth seekers had assumed that their empirical approach was the only valid method for understanding reality. And they were uncomfortable with the suggestion that idealistic vision was equally important. The idealists had believed that their inspirational approach was sufficient for achieving any goal. And they were disturbed by the implication that their visions needed to be constrained by factual limitations. The dragon attempted to serve both civilizations by teaching them how to integrate their different approaches. But this effort was complicated by the political dynamics within each society. Leaders in both civilizations had built their authority on the assumption that their particular philosophical approach was superior to alternatives. Accepting the dragon's teaching that both approaches were necessary would have required them to acknowledge that their rivals possessed valuable insights that their own traditions lacked. As tensions between the civilizations continued escalating, the stress of trying to mediate their conflicts began affecting the dragon's own psychological stability. This Pokémon had been designed to maintain balance and harmony, but it found itself caught between two groups whose fundamental assumptions about reality were incompatible. The dragon's efforts to serve both civilizations were producing contradictory demands on its abilities, creating internal conflicts that it wasn't equipped to resolve. The crisis reached its peak when political leaders in both civilizations demanded that the dragon demonstrate its loyalty by supporting their particular civilization's position in a territorial dispute. The truth-seeking civilization wanted the dragon to provide objective analysis that would prove their territorial claims were factually correct. The idealistic civilization wanted the dragon to endorse their vision of regional development that would require expanding into the disputed territory. The dragon's attempt to fulfill both requests simultaneously created a catastrophic resonance within its own power systems. The Pokémon's abilities were fundamentally unified, designed to integrate different aspects of cosmic power into coherent interventions. The demand that it serve contradictory purposes created internal tensions that exceeded its capacity to manage, triggering a breakdown that would transform the entire regional power structure. The breakdown manifested as a literal division of the dragon into two separate entities, each embodying one aspect of its original integrated nature. The first entity retained the dragon's connection to truth, accuracy, and empirical understanding, becoming the Pokémon that would later be known as Reshiram. This white dragon embodied the principles of factual correctness, rational analysis, and the pursuit of objective knowledge about how reality actually functioned. The second entity incorporated the dragon's connection to ideals, inspiration, and visionary transformation, becoming the Pokémon known as Zekrom. This black dragon embodied the principles of ambitious aspiration, creative vision, and the power of dedication and will to transform reality in accordance with inspiring goals. However, the division wasn't complete. A significant portion of the original dragon's essence couldn't be allocated to either truth or ideals because it represented the integration processes that had allowed the original entity to combine both approaches effectively. This remaining essence became Kyurem, a Pokémon whose abilities were focused on the potential for reunification and the maintenance of connections between separated elements. The emergence of these three Pokémon from the breakdown of the original dragon had immediate and dramatic effects on the regional conflict. Reshiram aligned itself with the truth-seeking civilization, providing them with unprecedented access to accurate information about environmental conditions, resource availability, and the consequences of different policy decisions. This enhanced knowledge allowed them to optimize their activities in ways that dramatically increased their effectiveness and prosperity. Zekrom partnered with the idealistic civilization, amplifying their capacity to envision and implement ambitious transformation projects. With the dragon's power supporting their efforts, they were able to undertake engineering projects and social reforms that exceeded anything they had previously imagined possible. Their cities became more magnificent, their technologies more advanced, and their cultural achievements more inspiring. However, the presence of these two extremely powerful Pokémon also escalated the civilization's capacity for conflict. Disputes that had previously been manageable became potentially catastrophic when each side possessed legendary Pokémon support that could devastate entire regions. The balance of power that had maintained peaceful coexistence was destroyed, replaced by a tense standoff between forces that could destroy each other completely, but couldn't achieve decisive victory without unacceptable losses. The situation was further complicated by the psychological effects of the dragon's division on the two new legendary Pokémon. Neither Reshiram nor Zekrom felt complete in their separated states. Each retained memories of their previous integrated existence and experienced their current condition as a form of traumatic amputation. This psychological distress made them more volatile and less stable in their decision-making, increasing the risk that their conflicts would escalate beyond the control of their human partners. Kyurem's role in this developing crisis was particularly complex. This Pokémon retained the original dragon's desire to maintain unity and integration, but its ability to achieve these goals had been severely compromised by the loss of the very elements it was trying to reunify. Kyurem could sense the incompleteness in both Reshiram and Zekrom, and it was driven by an overwhelming compulsion to restore the original unified state that had been lost. However, Kyurem's efforts to promote reunification were hampered by the political dynamics between the two civilizations. Neither society wanted to give up the advantages that their partnership with a legendary Pokémon provided, and both feared that reunification would result in their losing access to the power that had become central to their identity and capabilities. The impasse was finally broken when a new generation of leaders emerged in both civilizations, individuals who had grown up after the dragon's division and therefore weren't personally invested in the philosophical conflicts that had created the crisis. These younger leaders were more willing to consider approaches that integrated elements from both truth-seeking and idealistic traditions, and they were less concerned with defending the superiority of their particular cultural approach. However, even these more flexible leaders couldn't simply order their respective legendary Pokémon to reunify. The division had created genuine psychological and philosophical differences between Reshiram and Zekrom that couldn't be resolved through political negotiations alone. The two dragons had developed distinct personalities and perspectives during their separated existence, and they would need to work through their differences independently before reunification could become possible. The process of reconciliation between the separated dragons was facilitated by a series of conflicts with external threats that required both civilizations to cooperate for their mutual survival. These challenges demonstrated that neither truth-seeking nor idealistic approaches alone were sufficient for addressing complex problems, and that the most effective solutions required integration of both perspectives. As Reshiram and Zekrom worked together to address these external challenges, they began remembering the advantages of their previous integrated state. The White Dragon's analytical capabilities were enhanced by the Black Dragon's inspirational vision, while the Black Dragon's ambitious projects benefited from the White Dragon's factual accuracy. Their cooperation in addressing external threats gradually rebuilt the psychological connections that had been severed during their traumatic separation. Kyurem played a crucial role in this reconciliation process by serving as a repository for the integration patterns that had characterized the original dragon. When Reshiram and Zekrom were ready to begin reunification, Kyurem could provide the structural templates that would allow them to combine their separate developments into a new, integrated form that incorporated the growth and learning that had occurred during their period of separation. However, the reunification process revealed that the original division had created permanent changes that couldn't simply be reversed. Reshiram and Zekrom had developed distinct identities and capabilities during their separated existence, and these developments were valuable in their own right. Rather than returning to their previous unified state, the three Pokémon needed to establish new forms of integration that preserved their individual developments while enabling coordinated action when circumstances required it. This new approach to legendary Pokémon organization established important precedents for handling conflicts between cosmic forces that embodied opposing principles. Rather than assuming that such conflicts required one side to defeat the other, the Unova crisis demonstrated that opposing forces could maintain their distinct identities while learning to cooperate when their combined capabilities were needed to address challenges that neither could handle alone. The resolution of the Dragon Crisis also had significant implications for the civilizations that had been involved in the conflict. Both societies had learned that their particular philosophical approaches, while valuable, were insufficient for addressing all the challenges they faced. The truth-seeking civilization had discovered that purely empirical analysis couldn't generate the inspiration and motivation necessary for ambitious transformation projects. The idealistic civilization had learned that visionary aspiration needed to be grounded in accurate understanding of practical constraints and consequences. The integration of these insights led both civilizations to develop more sophisticated philosophical frameworks that incorporated elements from their former rivals' approaches. The truth-seekers developed methodologies for generating and evaluating inspiring visions based on empirical evidence, while the idealists learned to ground their aspirational projects in careful analysis of practical requirements and potential consequences. However, the regional stability that emerged from this reconciliation was tested by the arrival of new challenges that required different forms of legendary Pokémon intervention. The technological capabilities that both civilizations had developed during their period of competition had environmental consequences that exceeded the capacity of existing environmental management systems to address. The response to these new environmental challenges required the development of legendary Pokémon, whose abilities were specifically designed for managing the complex interactions between advanced technology, natural ecosystems, and the atmospheric processes that maintained planetary habitability. This need led to the emergence of 3 Pokémon whose roles focused on weather control and atmospheric regulation at scales that could counteract the effects of large-scale industrial activity. Tornadus emerged as the embodiment of wind patterns and atmospheric circulation, with abilities that could redistribute air masses on continental scales and manage the complex interactions between different atmospheric layers that maintained stable weather patterns. This Pokémon's influence was essential for preventing the buildup of industrial pollutants in concentrated areas and for maintaining the atmospheric circulation patterns that distributed heat and moisture effectively across planetary surfaces. Thunderous represented the electrical aspects of atmospheric processes, controlling lightning patterns, electromagnetic fields, and the electrical charges that influenced cloud formation and precipitation. This Pokémon's abilities were crucial for maintaining the electrical balance that prevented dangerous storm systems from developing, while ensuring that beneficial precipitation occurred when and where it was needed for ecosystem health. Landorus embodied the connections between atmospheric and terrestrial processes, managing the interactions between weather patterns and ground-based ecosystems that were essential for maintaining soil fertility, water distribution, and the complex relationships between atmospheric and biological systems. This Pokémon could ensure that atmospheric changes supported rather than disrupted terrestrial ecosystems, preventing weather-related environmental disasters while promoting conditions that enhanced biological productivity. These 3 Pokémon were designed to work as a coordinated system, with each managing different aspects of the complex atmospheric processes that required integrated management to function effectively. However, their emergence also created new potential for conflicts similar to those that had affected the elemental birds in previous eras. The situation was further complicated by the arrival of a group of Pokémon whose role was to protect other Pokémon and ecosystems from the negative consequences of conflicts between legendary Pokémon or advanced civilizations. These Pokémon, who would become known as the Swords of Justice, represented a new approach to legendary Pokémon intervention that focused on protection and defense rather than environmental management or cosmic balance. Cobalion emerged as the leader of this group, a Pokémon whose abilities combined incredible physical capabilities with sophisticated understanding of justice, ethics, and the principles that should govern intervention in conflicts between different groups. This Pokémon could assess complex situations involving multiple parties with conflicting interests and develop intervention strategies that protected the most vulnerable participants while respecting the legitimate rights and interests of all involved parties. Terrakion specialized in direct physical intervention, possessing the strength and durability necessary to protect endangered communities from threats that exceeded their capacity to handle independently. However, this Pokémon's interventions were always guided by ethical principles that ensured that protective actions didn't cause unnecessary harm to any of the parties involved in conflicts. Virizion focused on protecting natural environments and Pokémon communities from the negative effects of conflicts between larger forces. This Pokémon could create safe refuges where endangered species could survive during periods of environmental instability and could help damaged ecosystems recover after conflicts had ended. The fourth member of this group, Keldeo, was originally an ordinary Pokémon who had been trained by the other three to serve as their representative in situations that required more direct interaction with non-legendary Pokémon communities. Keldeo's abilities were less cosmic in scale than those of its mentors, but its closer connection to ordinary Pokémon experience made it effective at understanding and addressing the specific needs of communities that were affected by legendary Pokémon conflicts. The Swords of Justice represented an important evolution in legendary Pokémon organization, establishing the principle that cosmic-scale entities had responsibilities to protect smaller-scale beings who might be harmed by conflicts or interventions that were necessary for maintaining universal stability. This principle would become increasingly important as the universe continued developing and the potential for unintended consequences from legendary Pokémon actions continued growing. However, the implementation of these protective principles was complicated by the emergence of Pokémon, whose abilities were focused on enhancing the capabilities of individuals rather than managing large-scale environmental or cosmic processes. Victini represented the forces of success, victory, and the achievement of ambitious goals through dedication and effort. This Pokémon's influence could enhance the effectiveness of individuals or groups who were working toward beneficial objectives, providing them with the additional capabilities necessary to overcome obstacles that would normally be insurmountable. Victini's abilities were particularly valuable for civilizations that were attempting to implement the kinds of integrated approaches to truth-seeking and idealistic aspiration that had emerged from the resolution of the Unova Dragon Crisis. The Pokémon could provide the additional motivation, insight, and capability that individuals needed to master the complex skills required for combining empirical analysis with visionary thinking. However, Victini's power to enhance success also raised ethical questions about fairness and the appropriate limits of legendary Pokémon intervention in competitions between different individuals or groups. If one party in a conflict had access to Victini's assistance while others did not, the resulting advantages might be so significant as to make meaningful competition impossible. The resolution of these ethical challenges required developing protocols for legendary Pokémon intervention that ensured that their assistance was available to all parties who met appropriate criteria, rather than being allocated based on favoritism or arbitrary selection. These protocols established the principle that legendary Pokémon power should enhance rather than replace the efforts of those who received assistance, and that the criteria for receiving assistance should be based on the beneficial nature of the goals being pursued rather than on the identity or characteristics of those pursuing them. As this era of ideological integration drew to a close, the universe had developed significantly more sophisticated approaches to managing conflicts between different perspectives, values, and goals. The traumatic division and eventual reconciliation of the Unova Dragon had demonstrated that opposing forces could learn to work together without abandoning their distinct identities and contributions. The emergence of protective legendary Pokémon had established the principle that cosmic-scale entities had responsibilities to consider the welfare of smaller-scale beings who might be affected by their actions. Most importantly, the events of this era had shown that legendary Pokémon themselves were capable of growth, learning, and adaptation in response to new challenges and circumstances. The assumption that cosmic forces were static and unchangeable had been replaced by recognition that even the most powerful entities in the universe could evolve their approaches and capabilities as the cosmos itself continued developing toward greater complexity and sophistication. The stage was now set for even more complex challenges that would test whether the collaborative and protective principles developed during this era could handle threats to universal stability that operated on scales and through methods that had never been encountered before. The next phase of legendary Pokémon evolution would need to address challenges that crossed the boundaries between different dimensions of reality itself. As the universe continued evolving toward greater complexity, The sophisticated conflict resolution mechanisms developed during the Unova crisis proved insufficient for addressing a new category of challenges that emerged when advanced civilizations began developing technologies that could fundamentally alter the basic processes of life and death. The collaborative approaches that had successfully integrated opposing ideological perspectives weren't designed to handle conflicts between forces so fundamental that compromise between them was literally impossible. The emergence of these life and death conflicts was first detected in a region that would later be known as Kalos, where multiple advanced civilizations had converged around the discovery of what appeared to be the universe's most concentrated source of life-generating energy. This discovery represented a quantum leap beyond the biological enhancement capabilities that Ho-Oh had demonstrated in previous eras, offering the possibility of creating entirely new forms of life, or even reversing the entropy processes that made death inevitable for biological organisms. The civilizations that gathered in Kalos represented the most sophisticated societies the universe had yet produced, each having mastered different aspects of the advanced technologies and philosophical frameworks that had emerged from previous legendary Pokémon crises. However, their technological capabilities had reached levels where their activities could potentially destabilize the fundamental forces that maintained the boundary between life and death throughout the universe. The source of the life-generating energy was eventually identified as Xerneas, a legendary Pokémon whose abilities transcended the biological enhancement powers of previous life-affiliated legendaries. Where Ho-Oh could restore extinct species and enhance existing biological capabilities, Xerneas possessed the power to generate entirely new forms of life from pure energy, bypassing the normal evolutionary processes that had governed biological development since Mew's genetic template was established. Xerneas's abilities operated through direct manipulation of what could best be described as the life force itself, the fundamental energy that distinguished living systems from inanimate matter. This Pokémon could infuse non-living materials with life energy, transforming them into biological organisms with capabilities that exceeded anything that natural evolution could have produced. More remarkably, it could enhance the life energy of existing organisms to such an extent that they became functionally immortal, immune to aging, disease, and most forms of physical damage. The Pokémon's appearance reflected its cosmic significance. Xerneas manifested as a magnificent deer-like creature whose antlers incorporated crystalline structures that pulsed with visible life energy. These antlers weren't simply decorative features, but were the focal points through which Xerneas channeled its life-generating powers. When the Pokémon was actively using its abilities, the antlers would glow with rainbow-colored light that could be seen from vast distances, serving as a beacon that attracted life energy from throughout the region. However, Xerneas's tremendous life-generating capabilities came with a significant limitation that would prove crucial for universal stability. The Pokémon's powers operated on a cyclical basis, alternating between active periods when it could generate unlimited quantities of life energy and dormant periods when it entered a tree-like state that was indistinguishable from non-living matter. These dormancy periods weren't voluntary rest phases, but were necessary for Xerneas to process and integrate the cosmic energies required for its life generation activities. The civilizations that encountered Xerneas initially viewed these dormancy cycles as inconvenient limitations that should be overcome through technological intervention. Their scientists developed increasingly sophisticated methods for artificially stimulating Xerneas's life-generating abilities, attempting to maintain the Pokémon in perpetual activity that would provide unlimited access to life enhancement technologies. However, these attempts to override Xerneas's natural cycles created cosmic imbalances that attracted the attention of forces that the universe had not previously encountered. The unlimited generation of life energy without corresponding dormancy periods began disrupting the fundamental equilibrium between creation and entropy that had maintained universal stability since the earliest cosmic construction phases. The disruption manifested first as the emergence of Yveltal, a legendary Pokémon whose nature was diametrically opposed to Xerneas's life generation capabilities. Where Xerneas created and enhanced life, Yveltal embodied the forces of death, destruction, and entropy that were necessary counterbalances to unlimited life generation. This Pokemon's abilities could drain life energy from biological organisms, accelerate aging and decay processes, and even absorb the life force from entire ecosystems when the imbalance between life and death became severe enough to threaten universal stability. Yveltal's appearance was as ominous as its abilities were destructive. The Pokémon manifested as a massive bird-like creature with wings that seemed to absorb light rather than reflecting it, creating zones of darkness that extended far beyond its physical form. Its eyes glowed with red energy that could paralyze living beings with existential terror, while its cry could drain life energy from any organism that heard it directly. However, despite its terrifying appearance and devastating capabilities, Yveltal wasn't a malevolent entity bent on universal destruction. Its role was to serve as a necessary counterbalance to Xerneas's life generation abilities, ensuring that the universe didn't become saturated with life energy to the point where the basic physical laws that governed matter and energy relationships would break down. The emergence of both Xerneas and Yveltal created an unprecedented crisis for the civilizations that had gathered in Kalos. The life generation technologies they had developed based on Xerneas's abilities were producing beneficial results that exceeded their most optimistic projections, extending lifespans, eliminating diseases, and creating new biological capabilities that seemed to offer solutions to every challenge their societies faced. However, Yveltal's presence meant that these achievements were constantly threatened by entropy forces that could reverse all their progress instantly. The Pokemon's life-draining abilities could undo centuries of biological enhancement in moments, while its presence created psychological stress among populations that had become accustomed to viewing death and aging as conquered problems rather than natural processes. The conflict between these two cosmic forces quickly escalated beyond anything the collaborative mediation techniques developed during previous legendary Pokémon crises could address. Xerneas and Yveltal weren't representing different approaches to the same underlying goal, as had been the case with Reshiram and Zekram's truth versus ideals conflict. Instead, they embodied fundamentally incompatible cosmic principles whose coexistence required a delicate balance that the civilizations of Kalos were inadvertently disrupting. The civilization's attempts to suppress Yveltal's influence while maximizing their access to Xerneas's capabilities created a feedback loop that intensified both Pokemon's abilities to dangerous levels. Xerneas, responding to what it perceived as threats to life throughout the region, began generating life energy at unprecedented rates, while Yveltal countered by increasing its entropy-inducing activities to maintain cosmic balance. The escalating conflict between life and death forces began affecting the basic structure of reality in the Kalos region. Areas where Xerneas's influence was strongest experienced runaway biological growth that consumed resources faster than they could be replenished, while regions dominated by Yveltal's entropy effects suffered rapid decay that threatened to reduce entire ecosystems to lifeless wastes. The crisis reached a critical point when the imbalance between life and death forces began creating spatial distortions that threatened to spread beyond the Kalos region and affect universal stability. The excessive life energy being generated by Xerneas was creating pockets of space where the normal laws of physics were overwhelmed by biological processes, while Yveltal's entropy fields were generating voids, where even the fundamental forces that held matter together were breaking down. The resolution to this crisis came from an unexpected source. Rather than emerging from mediation between the conflicting forces or from external intervention by other legendary Pokémon, the solution arose from the cosmic depths, where the most fundamental aspects of universal structure were maintained. Zygarde emerged as a Pokémon whose role transcended the specific conflict between life and death forces to encompass the broader challenge of maintaining ecosystem balance in the face of any disruption that threatened universal stability. This Pokémon embodied the principles of ecological regulation and environmental homeostasis that were necessary for preventing any single force, regardless of how beneficial it might appear, from dominating to the extent that it destabilized the complex relationships that maintained universal functionality. However, Zygarde's approach to ecosystem management was fundamentally different from the intervention strategies employed by previous legendary Pokémon. Rather than manifesting as a single powerful entity that could impose solutions through superior force, Zygarde existed as a distributed consciousness that could monitor and respond to ecological imbalances throughout the universe simultaneously. This distributed existence was made possible by Zygarde's unique cellular structure. The Pokémon existed as a collection of microscopic cores and cells that could function independently while maintaining connection to a shared consciousness that coordinated their activities. These individual components could remain dormant and undetectable for extended periods, monitoring environmental conditions and gathering information about developing imbalances. When ecological threats were detected, the appropriate number of Zygarde cells would congregate and combine to form manifestations with the specific capabilities needed to address the particular challenge. Minor imbalances might require only a small percentage of available cells, creating relatively modest interventions that could correct problems before they became serious. However, major threats to universal stability could trigger the assembly of Zygarde's complete form, a manifestation whose power approached that of the original creation trio. Zygarde's initial response to the life-death imbalance in Kalos involved manifesting in its 10% form, a canine-like entity that possessed sufficient speed and agility to monitor the rapidly changing situation while avoiding the destructive effects of the conflict between Xerneas and Yveltal. This form allowed Zygarde to gather detailed information about the specific mechanisms that were creating the crisis, and to identify intervention points where relatively small actions could produce significant stabilizing effects. However, as the conflict continued escalating and the spatial distortions began threatening universal stability, Zygarde assembled additional cells to create its 50% form, a serpentine manifestation whose power could directly counter both excessive life generation and runaway entropy. This form possessed the capability to drain excess life energy from oversaturated areas while simultaneously providing life support to regions that were being damaged by entropy effects. The intervention strategies employed by Zygarde's 50% form were sophisticated applications of ecosystem management principles that addressed the root causes of the life-death imbalance, rather than simply suppressing its symptoms. Rather than trying to defeat either Xerneas or Yveltal, Zygarde focused on re-establishing the natural cycling patterns that allowed both Pokémon to fulfill their cosmic roles, without creating destructive interference with each other. The key insight that guided Zygarde's intervention was that the civilizations of Kalos had disrupted not just the balance between life and death forces, but the temporal cycling that allowed these opposing forces to operate sequentially rather than simultaneously. Xerneas's dormancy periods weren't limitations to be overcome, but were essential phases that allowed the cosmic life generation processes to reset and prepare for the next active cycle. Similarly, Yveltal's entropy activities weren't random destructive outbursts, but were carefully timed interventions that cleared away biological accumulations that would otherwise interfere with healthy ecosystem functioning. The Pokémon's life-draining abilities served to recycle biological energy back into forms that could support new life generation during Xerneas's next active phase. Zygarde's intervention involved re-establishing the temporal coordination between these cycling processes, while protecting the civilizations of Kalos from the more destructive aspects of the natural cycles. This required developing new technologies and social structures that could work within the life-death cycling, rather than attempting to override it. However, even Zygarde's sophisticated ecosystem management capabilities were tested when an external threat emerged that attempted to exploit the life-death imbalance for destructive purposes. A human organization had developed technologies that could artificially trigger Yveltal's most extreme destructive capabilities, potentially using the Pokémon's entropy powers as a weapon that could devastate entire planetary systems. This threat required Zygarde to manifest in its complete form for the first time in universal history. The assembled entity possessed capabilities that rivaled the original creation trio, with the ability to manipulate the fundamental forces that governed biological, geological, and even cosmic processes. In this form, Zygarde could counter threats that operated on scales that exceeded the capacity of any single planetary ecosystem to address. The complete form's intervention involved not just stopping the immediate threat, but implementing comprehensive reforms in how civilizations throughout the universe approached life enhancement technologies. Zygarde established new protocols that ensured that biological enhancement projects were coordinated with natural cycling processes rather than attempting to override them. However, the events in Kalos also revealed the existence of another legendary Pokémon, whose abilities posed challenges that even Zygarde's ecosystem management capabilities couldn't address through conventional intervention. Strategies. Hoopa represented forces of dimensional manipulation and space-time distortion that could potentially destabilize the universe through mechanisms that transcended ecological balance. Hoopa's abilities were focused on creating and manipulating dimensional portals that could connect any two locations in the universe instantaneously. These portals weren't simple transportation devices, but were manifestations of the Pokémon's capacity to bend space-time in ways that allowed it to access and redistribute resources, energy, and even other Pokémon across vast distances. The Pokémon's origins traced back to ancient civilizations that had experimented with dimensional manipulation technologies, though the exact circumstances of its creation remained obscured by the temporal distortions that its abilities generated. What was clear was that Hoopa possessed powers that could potentially destabilize the careful balance of forces that maintained universal stability. In its confined form, Hoopa appeared as a relatively small humanoid Pokémon, whose abilities were limited to creating portals of modest size and duration. However, this contained state was artificially maintained by a prison bottle that had been created by ancient civilizations, specifically to prevent Hoopa from accessing its full capabilities. When freed from these constraints, Hoopa could manifest in its unbound form, a massive entity whose dimensional manipulation abilities operated on cosmic scales. In this state, Hoopa could create portals large enough to transport entire planets, redirect stellar energy flows, and even access dimensions that existed outside the normal structure of space-time. The danger posed by unbound Hoopa wasn't simply its tremendous power, but its psychological instability that made it unpredictable and potentially destructive. The Pokémon's dimensional abilities had isolated it from normal social interaction for extended periods, creating psychological distortions that made it difficult for Hoopa to understand the consequences of its actions or to form stable relationships with other entities. Hoopa's dimensional portals could inadvertently create connections between incompatible regions of space-time, allowing forces like Giratina's antimatter energy to leak into the primary universe, or permitting other cosmic-level threats to bypass the containment systems that maintained universal stability. The Pokémon's tendency to treat reality as a playground for its dimensional manipulation experiments posed ongoing risks that required constant monitoring and intervention. The containment of Hoopa required developing new collaborative approaches that combined the ecosystem management capabilities of Zygarde with the dimensional expertise of other legendary Pokémon who understood space-time manipulation. The solution involved creating a network of dimensional monitoring stations that could detect and respond to unauthorized portal activity while providing Hoopa with controlled opportunities to exercise its abilities in ways that didn't threaten universal stability. However, the most significant challenge posed by Hoopa wasn't its direct dimensional manipulation capabilities, but its ability to summon other legendary Pokémon through its portals. This power allowed Hoopa to bring together legendary Pokémon from different regions and eras, creating unprecedented concentrations of cosmic-level power that could overwhelm the careful balance mechanisms that had evolved to manage legendary Pokémon interactions. The potential for such concentrations had been demonstrated during the crisis resolution, when Hoopa had summoned multiple legendary Pokémon to assist in containing various threats. While this intervention had been beneficial in that specific instance, the precedent it established raised concerns about the stability of the distributed approach to legendary Pokémon organization that had evolved over universal history. The resolution of these concerns required developing new protocols for legendary Pokémon interaction that could handle the kind of rapid, large-scale coordination that Hoopa's portal abilities made possible. These protocols needed to balance the advantages of being able to quickly assemble legendary Pokémon task forces with the risks of creating power concentrations that could destabilize regional or universal balance. The events in Kalos had demonstrated that the universe had evolved to a level of complexity where individual legendary Pokémon, regardless of their power levels, were insufficient for addressing the challenges that could emerge from the interaction between multiple cosmic-level forces. The successful management of life-death ecosystem balance had required unprecedented coordination between different types of legendary Pokémon abilities. This coordination had been achieved not through hierarchical command structures or predetermined response protocols, but through the development of sophisticated communication and decision-making processes that allowed legendary Pokémon to adapt their collaborative efforts to address novel challenges as they emerged. The Kalos crisis had also revealed that the relationship between legendary Pokémon and advanced civilizations was entering a new phase characterized by genuine partnership rather than simple protection or guidance. The technological capabilities that civilizations had developed were approaching levels where they could serve as valuable allies in addressing cosmic-level challenges rather than simply being beneficiaries of legendary Pokémon intervention. However, this partnership also created new responsibilities for both legendary Pokémon and civilizations. Legendary Pokémon needed to develop more sophisticated understanding of technological capabilities and limitations, while civilizations needed to accept greater responsibility for considering the cosmic-level consequences of their activities. As this era of life-death ecosystem balance drew to a close, the universe had developed mechanisms for managing conflicts between the most fundamental forces that governed existence itself. The principles established during the Kalos crisis would prove essential for addressing even more complex challenges that would emerge when the universe encountered forces that operated from outside its own structure entirely. The collaborative networks that had evolved to manage the relationships between Xerneas, Yveltal, Zygarde, and Hoopa represented the most sophisticated legendary Pokémon organization that the universe had yet achieved. These networks would be tested by future challenges that crossed dimensional boundaries and involved forces that didn't share the same fundamental assumptions about the nature of reality itself. The stage was set for encounters with entities from alternate dimensions whose very existence would challenge the assumptions upon which the entire legendary Pokémon organizational structure had been built, forcing both cosmic entities and advanced civilizations to reconsider their understanding of what it meant to maintain stability in a universe that was far more complex and interconnected than had ever been imagined. Act 8. Dimensions Beyond Reality, Ultra Space and Alternate Worlds. The sophisticated legendary Pokémon organizational networks that had evolved to manage life-death ecosystem balance in Kalos proved insufficient when the universe encountered its first major incursion from forces that operated according to fundamentally different physical laws and dimensional structures. The collaborative approaches that had successfully integrated opposing cosmic principles within the established universal framework weren't designed to handle entities whose very existence challenged the basic assumptions upon which that framework was built. The first indications of these extra-dimensional challenges emerged when spacefaring civilizations began detecting anomalous energy signatures that didn't correspond to any known physical phenomena. These signatures appeared to originate from regions of space where conventional instruments detected nothing unusual, suggesting that the energy sources existed in dimensions that were parallel to, but separate from, normal space-time. Advanced civilizations initially interpreted these anomalous readings as evidence of previously undiscovered natural phenomena, or possibly new categories of legendary Pokémon, whose abilities operated through mechanisms that exceeded current understanding. However, as the energy signatures became more frequent and intense, it became apparent that they represented something far more significant than simply another category of cosmic entity. The breakthrough in understanding came when researchers developed detection technologies capable of perceiving dimensional boundaries that existed beyond the three spatial dimensions and single temporal dimension that comprised normal space-time. These technologies revealed the existence of what appeared to be an entirely separate dimensional complex that existed in parallel to the established universe, but operated according to different fundamental principles. This parallel dimensional complex, which became known as ultraspace, contained regions where the normal relationships between matter, energy, space, and time were altered in ways that permitted the existence of entities and phenomena that would be impossible within the established universal structure. Most remarkably, ultraspace appeared to be inhabited by forms of consciousness and organization that had evolved independently of the legendary Pokémon networks that governed the primary universe. The discovery of ultraspace represented a paradigm shift that challenged the assumption that Arceus's cosmic creation represented the totality of existence. The possibility that other creative forces had established alternative dimensional frameworks, with their own cosmic entities and organizational principles, forced a complete reconsideration of what it meant to maintain universal stability. The first direct contact with ultraspace entities occurred when dimensional barriers that normally kept the two systems separate began showing signs of instability. These barriers weren't permanent fixtures, but were maintained by complex interactions between the fundamental forces of both dimensional systems. As civilizations in the primary universe continued developing technologies that manipulated space-time, their activities began creating resonances that weakened the dimensional boundaries. The weakening barriers allowed the first ultraspace entity to emerge into the primary universe. Cosmog appeared as a gaseous, nebular Pokémon whose cellular structure incorporated principles that violated several fundamental laws of physics as they operated in normal space-time. This entity existed in a state of continuous development, constantly absorbing cosmic energy and growing towards some form of maturity that couldn't be predicted based on conventional biological or cosmic evolution patterns. Cosmog's presence in the primary universe created immediate challenges for the legendary Pokémon responsible for maintaining cosmic stability. The entity's energy absorption processes drew power from sources that were essential for normal universal functions, while its growth patterns generated spatial distortions that interfered with the carefully balanced relationships between different cosmic forces. However, attempts to contain or redirect Cosmog's development proved counterproductive. The entity's ultraspace origins made it fundamentally incompatible with the containment technologies that had been developed for managing legendary Pokémon from the primary universe. Efforts to suppress its energy absorption simply caused it to draw power from alternative sources, while attempts to redirect its growth patterns created feedback loops that destabilized both dimensional systems. The resolution of this crisis required developing entirely new approaches to legendary Pokémon interaction that recognized the legitimacy of alternative dimensional frameworks, rather than trying to force ultraspace entities to conform to primary universe principles. This represented a major evolution in cosmic diplomacy, moving beyond the integration of opposing forces within a single framework to encompass coordination between entirely different cosmic systems. The key to this new approach was understanding that Cosmog's seemingly random energy absorption and growth patterns were actually following developmental protocols that were perfectly rational within ultraspace's dimensional structure. The entity was progressing toward a form of cosmic maturity that would allow it to serve functions within ultraspace that were analogous to those performed by legendary Pokémon in the primary universe. This understanding led to the development of cooperative protocols that allowed Cosmog to continue its natural development while minimizing the disruptive effects on primary universe stability. Rather than trying to prevent the entity's energy absorption, legendary Pokémon worked to redirect it toward energy sources that were abundant in the primary universe, but were less critical for maintaining cosmic balance. The success of these cooperative protocols became apparent when Cosmog reached maturity and evolved into one of two possible forms, depending on the specific energy patterns it had absorbed during its development. The first possible evolution was Solgaleo, an entity that embodied the solar aspects of cosmic energy and served functions within ultraspace that were similar to those performed by legendary Pokémon associated with light, growth, and positive energy in the primary universe. Solgaleo's abilities included the capacity to generate and distribute solar energy on cosmic scales, though its methods operated through dimensional manipulation rather than the direct stellar processes employed by primary universe legendaries. The entity could create portals that channeled energy between different regions of ultraspace, maintaining the energy distribution patterns that supported life and activity throughout the dimensional complex. However, Solgaleo's solar functions weren't simply analogous to primary universe processes, but incorporated dimensional manipulation capabilities that exceeded anything that primary universe legendaries had developed. The entity could create stable wormholes that connected distant regions of spacetime, allowing for transportation and communication across cosmic distances that would normally require eons to traverse. The second possible evolution was Lunala, an entity that represented the lunar aspects of cosmic energy and served complementary functions to Solgaleo's solar activities. Where Solgaleo generated and distributed energy, Lunala managed the absorption and recycling processes that prevented ultraspace from becoming saturated with excessive energy concentrations. Lunala's abilities included the capacity to absorb various forms of energy and convert them into the specific types needed for different ultraspace functions. This recycling capability was essential for maintaining the energy balance that allowed ultraspace's altered physical laws to function without creating instabilities that could affect the broader dimensional structure. Like Solgaleo, Lunala possessed dimensional manipulation capabilities that exceeded primary universe standards. The entity could create portals that functioned as energy absorption points, drawing excess energy from throughout ultraspace and redistributing it to regions where it was needed for maintaining dimensional stability. The emergence of these two fully developed ultraspace legendaries created opportunities for unprecedented cooperation between dimensional systems. Solgaleo and Lunala could serve as intermediaries between primary universe and ultraspace legendaries, facilitating communication and coordination that would have been impossible through direct contact between entities from incompatible dimensional frameworks. However, this cooperation was complicated by the arrival of another ultraspace entity whose nature posed significant threats to both dimensional systems. Necrozma had originally served as ultraspace's primary light-generating Pokémon, fulfilling functions that were crucial for maintaining the energy distribution patterns that supported life and activity throughout the dimensional complex. However, Necrozma had suffered some form of traumatic damage that had stripped away most of its light-generating capabilities, leaving it in a state of perpetual energy starvation that drove it to absorb light and energy from any available source. This absorption wasn't the controlled recycling process that Lunala managed, but was desperate and indiscriminate consumption that could drain entire regions of the energy they needed for basic functionality. Necrozma's condition created a crisis that affected both ultraspace and the primary universe. In ultraspace, the entity's energy absorption was disrupting the distribution patterns that maintained dimensional stability, while its presence in the primary universe posed threats to legendary Pokémon and civilizations that depended on stable energy relationships for their continued existence. The damaged Pokémon's appearance reflected its desperate condition. Necrozma manifested as a crystalline entity whose structure incorporated gaps and breaks where its light-generating capabilities had been damaged. These damaged areas constantly absorbed light and energy from the surrounding environment, creating zones of darkness that expanded as the Pokémon's energy starvation intensified. However, the most disturbing aspect of Necrozma's condition was its psychological state. The entity retained memories of its previous capabilities and cosmic responsibilities, creating a form of existential anguish that drove it to increasingly desperate attempts to restore its lost powers. These attempts often involved absorbing light and energy from sources that couldn't spare such losses, causing damage to other entities and systems that intensified Necrozma's isolation and psychological distress. The resolution of Necrozma's crisis required unprecedented cooperation between Solgaleo, Lunala, and primary universe legendaries who understood energy distribution and psychological healing. The damaged entity's condition couldn't be addressed through conventional healing methods because its problems operated on dimensional levels that exceeded the capacity of individual Pokémon to repair. The solution involved a fusion process that temporarily combined Necrozma with either Solgaleo or Lunala, allowing the damaged entity to access their intact energy generation and distribution capabilities. This fusion wasn't permanent merger, but was a therapeutic process that allowed Necrozma to experience restored functionality while its own damaged systems underwent repair. When fused with Solgaleo, Necrozma could access solar energy generation capabilities that temporarily satisfied its energy starvation while providing it with the power needed to begin repairing its damaged light-generating systems. This fusion form, known as Duskmane Necrozma, possessed capabilities that exceeded either entity's individual powers, demonstrating the potential benefits of cooperation between different dimensional frameworks. Similarly, fusion with Lunala allowed Necrozma to access lunar energy recycling capabilities that helped it process and integrate the excessive amounts of energy it had absorbed during its period of desperate consumption. This fusion form, Dawnwing's Necrozma, could redistribute Necrozma's absorbed energy in ways that benefited both dimensional systems rather than simply accumulating it in potentially dangerous concentrations. However, even these fusion processes weren't sufficient to fully restore Necrozma's original capabilities. The entity's damage had been so severe that complete healing required access to the fundamental light-generating processes that had originally created its cosmic role. This requirement led to the discovery of Necrozma's true original form, a manifestation whose power approached that of the creation trio in its scope and fundamental importance. Ultra Necrozma represented Necrozma's restoration to its original cosmic role as the primary light source for ultraspace. In this form, the entity possessed capabilities that transcended the individual abilities of other ultraspace legendaries, serving functions that were essential for maintaining the energy relationships that allowed the entire dimensional complex to exist. The restoration process that enabled Ultra Necrozma's manifestation required contributions from legendary Pokémon throughout both dimensional systems. Primary universe legendaries provided energy and expertise that helped stabilize the dimensional interfaces that allowed the fusion processes to function safely, while Ultra Space entities contributed the dimensional manipulation capabilities that were necessary for accessing Necrozma's original power patterns. This unprecedented level of interdimensional cooperation established new precedents for managing threats that affected multiple dimensional systems simultaneously. The success of Necrozma's restoration demonstrated that challenges operating on cosmic scales could be addressed through collaborative approaches that transcended the boundaries between different universal frameworks. However, the events surrounding Necrozma's crisis also revealed the existence of entities that posed threats to dimensional stability from entirely different directions. The Ultra Beasts represented a category of ultraspace inhabitants, whose nature made them fundamentally incompatible with primary universe conditions, yet who possessed the ability to cross dimensional boundaries and establish themselves in environments where their presence created ongoing instabilities. Unlike the cosmic-level entities like Solgaleo, Lunala, and Necrozma, whose roles within ultraspace were analogous to legendary Pokémon functions in the primary universe, the Ultra Beasts were more similar to highly specialized organisms that had evolved to thrive in ultraspace's altered physical conditions. Their abilities were focused on survival and adaptation rather than cosmic maintenance, but their survival strategies often involved manipulating their environment in ways that could destabilize dimensional boundaries. The first Ultra Beast to establish a significant presence in the primary universe was Nihilego, an entity whose parasitic capabilities allowed it to bond with and influence other organisms in ways that enhanced its own survival while potentially compromising the autonomy and well-being of its hosts. This bonding process wasn't malicious, but was an adaptation that had evolved to help Nihilego survive in ultraspace's challenging dimensional conditions. However, when applied to primary universe organisms, Nihilego's bonding capabilities could create psychological and physiological changes that were beneficial for the Ultra Beast, but potentially harmful for its hosts. The entity's influence could enhance physical capabilities and provide access to ultraspace energies, but these enhancements often came at the cost of emotional stability and independent decision-making capacity. The management of Ultra Beast incursions required developing new containment and integration strategies that recognized their status as legitimate inhabitants of an alternative dimensional framework, rather than simply treating them as invasive threats to be eliminated. This approach required understanding each Ultra Beast's specific survival needs and developing ways to meet those needs that didn't compromise primary universe stability. These management strategies were complicated by the simultaneous emergence of artificially created legendary Pokémon that represented primary universe civilizations' attempts to develop their own cosmic-level capabilities rather than relying on naturally occurring legendaries for protection and guidance. Type: Null represented the most sophisticated attempt to create artificial legendary Pokémon that had yet been undertaken. The creation of Type Null involved combining genetic material and technological enhancements from multiple legendary Pokémon, attempting to produce an entity that could adapt its capabilities to address whatever specific threats or challenges it encountered. This artificial Pokémon was designed to serve as the ultimate defensive system, capable of countering any form of attack or environmental challenge through rapid adaptation and capability modification. However, the artificial nature of Type Null's creation resulted in psychological and physiological limitations that prevented it from reaching its full potential. The entity's hybrid nature created internal conflicts between different legendary Pokémon influence patterns, while its artificial origins left it without the cosmic role clarity that provided naturally occurring legendaries with purpose and psychological stability. The resolution of these limitations required developing emotional bonds and supportive relationships that could provide Type Null with the psychological foundation it needed to achieve stability and growth. When provided with appropriate care and emotional support, the artificial Pokémon could evolve into Silvally, a form that retained its adaptive capabilities while gaining the psychological integration that allowed it to use those capabilities effectively. The success of Type Null's development into Silvally established important principles for the creation of artificial legendary Pokémon that would influence future attempts at such projects. The most crucial insight was that cosmic-level capabilities required not just power and adaptability, but also psychological integration and sense of purpose that could only be developed through genuine relationships and emotional support. However, the artificial creation of legendary Pokémon also raised ethical questions about the appropriate relationship between technological civilizations and cosmic forces. The traditional model of legendary Pokémon as naturally occurring entities whose cosmic roles were established through universal development processes was being challenged by the emergence of artificially created entities whose roles and responsibilities were determined by their creators rather than by cosmic necessity. These ethical considerations became increasingly important as the interdimensional cooperation protocols developed during the Ultra Space Crisis began generating new hybrid approaches to cosmic management that combined naturally occurring legendary Pokémon capabilities with technological enhancements and artificial intelligence systems. The integration of these different approaches created unprecedented opportunities for addressing cosmic-level challenges through collaborative efforts that transcended traditional boundaries between natural and artificial, primary universe and ultraspace, and individual entity capabilities and collective network effects. However, it also created new forms of complexity that challenged existing frameworks for maintaining cosmic stability and managing inter-entity relationships. As this era of dimensional expansion drew to a close, the universe had evolved from a single cosmic framework governed by naturally occurring legendary Pokémon to a multidimensional complex where natural entities, artificial creations, and interdimensional immigrants collaborated to maintain stability across multiple incompatible physical frameworks simultaneously. The precedents established during this period would prove essential for addressing even more complex challenges that would emerge when time itself became malleable, and the boundaries between past, present, and future began breaking down under the influence of technologies and entities whose capabilities transcended the temporal limitations that had previously constrained cosmic development. The stage was set for temporal paradoxes and causality loops that would test whether the collaborative networks developed during the Ultra Space Crisis could maintain stability when the very concept of sequential time became negotiable, and the possibility of altering past events created potential for unraveling the entire structure of universal history. The multi-dimensional collaborative networks that had evolved to manage the integration of ultra-space entities and artificial legendary Pokémon faced their most challenging test when advanced civilizations began developing. technologies that could manipulate the fundamental structure of time itself. The sophisticated protocols that had successfully managed conflicts between incompatible dimensional frameworks weren't designed to handle situations where the basic assumption of sequential causality could be violated through deliberate intervention. The emergence of temporal manipulation capabilities was first detected in the Paldea region, where multiple advanced civilizations had converged around archaeological discoveries that suggested the existence of technologies and entities whose origins preceded even the earliest cosmic construction phases. These discoveries challenged the assumption that universal history followed a linear progression from simple cosmic forces to increasingly complex organizational structures. The archaeological evidence indicated that highly sophisticated civilizations had existed in Paldea's distant past, possessing technologies that exceeded anything that contemporary societies had achieved, despite their access to legendary Pokémon partnerships and interdimensional cooperation protocols. Most remarkably, these ancient civilizations appeared to have developed methods for creating and controlling Pokémon, whose capabilities transcended the normal limitations of space and time. The first direct evidence of these temporal manipulation capabilities was discovered when excavations uncovered crystalline structures that contained what appeared to be Pokémon preserved in some form of temporal stasis. These weren't simply fossils or preserved remains, but were actual living Pokémon that had been isolated from the normal flow of time, maintaining their original vitality and capabilities, despite having existed in suspended animation for millions of years. The Pokémon discovered in these temporal preservation chambers defied conventional understanding of both evolutionary processes and legendary Pokémon categorization systems. Rather than representing either naturally evolved species or legendary Pokémon with cosmic roles, these entities appeared to be manifestations of temporal paradoxes that incorporated characteristics from multiple different time periods simultaneously. The most significant of these temporal anomalies was Terapagos, a Pokémon whose nature embodied the intersection of past, present, and future in ways that challenged the fundamental assumptions upon which cosmic stability had been maintained. This entity existed as a crystalline turtle whose shell incorporated temporal energy patterns that allowed it to access and manipulate different time periods directly. Terapagos possessed the ability to survive temporal disruptions that would be fatal to ordinary Pokémon, including paradoxes that created contradictory causality loops and discontinuities that severed connections between sequential time periods. The Pokémon's crystalline structure wasn't simply protective armor, but was a complex temporal processing system that allowed it to exist simultaneously in multiple time states while maintaining coherent consciousness and identity. However, the most remarkable aspect of Terapagos was its role as the source of terrestrial energy, a power that could temporarily alter the fundamental type characteristics of any Pokémon that was exposed to it. This transformation wasn't simply superficial modification, but involved accessing temporal echoes of evolutionary paths that the affected Pokémon might have followed under different historical circumstances. The terrestrial process revealed that every Pokémon carried within its genetic and cosmic structure the potential to manifest alternative type combinations that reflected different possible evolutionary outcomes. By accessing these temporal alternatives, terrestrial energy could temporarily grant Pokémon capabilities that transcended their normal limitations while maintaining their essential identity and consciousness. The discovery of Terapagos and the terrestrial phenomenon had profound implications for understanding the nature of time, evolution, and cosmic development. The existence of temporal energy patterns that could access alternative evolutionary paths suggested that the universe's development hadn't followed a single predetermined sequence, but instead represented just one possible outcome among countless alternatives that existed in parallel temporal streams. This revelation forced a complete reconsideration of the role that time played in cosmic stability and legendary Pokémon organization. The assumption that past events were fixed and that future developments followed logically from present conditions was challenged by evidence that temporal manipulation could access and potentially alter the fundamental structure of universal history. The implications became even more complex when researchers discovered that Terapagos wasn't the only Pokémon with temporal manipulation capabilities. The crystalline structures that had preserved it also contained evidence of other Pokémon whose abilities operated through temporal paradoxes that defied conventional understanding of causality and sequential development. The most significant of these discoveries involved Pokémon that appeared to represent evolutionary endpoints that had been achieved through time travel rather than normal developmental processes. These paradox Pokémon existed in forms that incorporated characteristics from both ancient past and distant future, creating biological impossibilities that could only be maintained through continuous temporal energy input. The first category of these paradox entities appeared to be ancient Pokémon that had been enhanced with capabilities from future evolutionary developments. These Pokémon possessed the primitive characteristics that would be expected from their ancient origins, but incorporated technological and biological enhancements that shouldn't have been possible during their original time periods. Koraidon represented the most sophisticated example of this category, manifesting as a Pokémon whose basic biological structure resembled ancient drake-like creatures, but whose capabilities incorporated technological enhancements that exceeded even contemporary mechanical systems. This entity could generate energy fields that mimicked advanced machinery while maintaining the biological flexibility and adaptability that characterized living organisms. However, Koraidon's technological capabilities weren't simply additions to its biological nature, but represented a complete integration of organic and mechanical principles that created new categories of functionality. The Pokémon could transform its biological structures to serve mechanical functions, while using its organic adaptability to optimize technological processes in ways that purely artificial systems couldn't achieve. The second category of paradox Pokémon appeared to represent the opposite temporal direction, incorporating ancient characteristics into Pokémon that originated from distant future periods. These entities possessed highly advanced technological capabilities that exceeded contemporary understanding, but manifested through biological structures that resembled primitive evolutionary forms. Miraidon exemplified this category, appearing as a Pokémon whose surface characteristics resembled ancient reptilian forms, but whose internal structure incorporated technological principles that operated through mechanisms that contemporary science couldn't explain. This entity could generate and manipulate energy fields that exceeded the capabilities of any known technology, while maintaining biological characteristics that allowed it to adapt and evolve in response to changing circumstances. The existence of both temporal directions of paradox Pokémon suggested that time manipulation technologies had been developed independently by civilizations from both ancient past and distant future, creating a complex web of temporal interactions that affected the entire structure of universal development. However, the most disturbing discovery was that these temporal manipulations hadn't been conducted in isolation, but had created cascading effects that influenced the development of legendary Pokémon and cosmic stability throughout universal history. The temporal energy patterns that maintained paradox Pokémon existence were drawing power from the same sources that supported normal cosmic functions, creating resource conflicts that threatened the stability of established systems. The investigation into these temporal conflicts revealed that Terrapagos served not just as a source of terrestrial energy, but as a temporal anchor that maintained stability in regions where multiple time streams intersected. The Pokémon's crystalline shell served as a processing center that could resolve temporal paradoxes and maintain coherent causality patterns, even when conflicting time manipulation technologies were operating simultaneously. This temporal anchor function had become increasingly important as more paradox Pokémon began manifesting throughout the Paldea region. Each new paradox entity created additional strain on the local temporal stability, requiring Terrapagos to expand its processing capabilities to maintain coherent causality patterns across the entire region. However, Terrapagos's temporal processing capabilities were approaching their limits as the number and complexity of temporal paradoxes continued increasing. The Pokémon's efforts to maintain stability were drawing enormous amounts of energy from both temporal and spatial sources, creating resource shortages that affected other legendary Pokémon throughout the region. The crisis reached a critical point when the temporal strain created by multiple paradox Pokémon began generating resonance effects that threatened to destabilize time flow throughout the entire universe. The assumption that temporal manipulations would remain localized to the regions where they were generated proved incorrect when the cascading effects began propagating through the fundamental temporal structure that governed cosmic development. The resolution of this crisis required unprecedented cooperation between legendary Pokémon, whose abilities operated across different temporal scales. Dialga's cosmic-level time manipulation capabilities were essential for understanding and containing the large-scale effects of the temporal paradoxes, while Celebi's more localized time travel abilities provided the fine-scale intervention capacity needed to address specific causality violations. However, even this cooperation was insufficient for addressing the full scope of the temporal crisis. The resolution required developing entirely new approaches to time manipulation that could work with, rather than against, the natural temporal flows that governed universal development. The key insight came from understanding that the temporal paradoxes weren't violations of cosmic law, but were manifestations of alternative development paths that had always existed as potential outcomes but had been suppressed by the dominance of the primary temporal stream. Rather than trying to eliminate these alternatives, the solution involved integrating them into the cosmic structure in ways that enhanced rather than threatened universal stability. This integration was achieved through the development of temporal distribution protocols that allowed paradox Pokémon to exist without drawing excessive energy from primary timeline sources. By accessing energy from the alternative temporal streams that they represented, these entities could maintain their paradoxical nature while contributing to, rather than detracting from, overall cosmic stability. The implementation of these protocols required Terrapagos to undergo a transformation that enhanced its temporal processing capabilities while distributing the workload across multiple temporal anchor points throughout the region. Rather than serving as a single central processor, Terrapagos learned to create a network of temporal stabilization nodes that could handle different aspects of paradox management simultaneously. This distributed approach to temporal management proved successful not just for resolving the immediate crisis, but for establishing new frameworks that could accommodate the increasing complexity of temporal interactions that were likely to emerge as civilizations continued developing time manipulation technologies. However, the events in Paldea also revealed that temporal manipulation technologies were just one aspect of a broader category of reality alteration capabilities that were being developed by advanced civilizations throughout the universe. The success of the temporal integration protocols encouraged other civilizations to experiment with technologies that could alter other fundamental aspects of cosmic structure. These experiments began creating new categories of challenges that combined temporal manipulation with dimensional alteration, energy redistribution, and even consciousness modification technologies. The collaborative networks that had evolved to manage individual categories of cosmic challenge were being tested by hybrid threats that crossed traditional boundaries between different domains of legendary Pokémon responsibility. The most significant of these hybrid challenges involved civilizations that had developed technologies capable of creating artificial pocket universes with customized physical laws and temporal structures. These pocket universes weren't simply isolated dimensional spaces, but were complete cosmic frameworks that could potentially serve as alternatives to the established universal structure. The creation of these artificial universes raised fundamental questions about the nature of cosmic authority and the limits of technological development. If civilizations could create their own cosmic frameworks with customized legendary Pokémon and organizational principles, what was the appropriate relationship between these artificial systems and the naturally occurring universal structure that had evolved through eons of cosmic development? The resolution of these questions required developing new forms of cosmic diplomacy that could accommodate multiple, incompatible universal frameworks while maintaining overall stability across the broader multidimensional complex that was emerging. This diplomacy had to balance respect for the autonomy of artificial universe creators with the need to prevent their activities from destabilizing the established cosmic order. The protocols that emerged from these negotiations established the principle that artificial universe creation was legitimate, provided that it didn't interfere with the functioning of established cosmic systems. However, the implementation of this principle required developing monitoring and intervention capabilities that could detect and respond to potential conflicts between different universal frameworks before they became destabilizing. This monitoring responsibility was shared among multiple legendary Pokémon, whose capabilities operated across different dimensional and temporal scales. The collaborative networks that had evolved to manage previous cosmic challenges were expanded to encompass the new category of inter-universal coordination that was becoming necessary as the cosmos continued evolving toward greater complexity. As this era of temporal paradox resolution drew to a close, the universe had evolved from a single temporal framework, governed by sequential causality, to a complex multi-temporal system where past, present, and future could interact directly through controlled paradox management. The establishment of temporal distribution protocols had made it possible to accommodate alternative development paths without destabilizing the primary cosmic structure. However, this temporal complexity also created new vulnerabilities that would be tested by future challenges involving entities and technologies that operated across multiple dimensional and temporal frameworks simultaneously. The precedents established during the Paldea crisis would prove essential for maintaining cosmic stability as the universe entered its next phase of development, where the boundaries between natural and artificial, temporal and spatial, and individual and collective would become increasingly fluid and negotiable. The stage was set for the emergence of challenges that would test whether the collaborative networks developed to manage temporal paradoxes could maintain stability when the very concepts of identity, causality, and cosmic purpose became subject to deliberate manipulation by entities whose capabilities approached those of the original creation forces themselves. As we reach the end of this journey through the vast timeline of legendary Pokémon, we find ourselves confronting a profound truth that has emerged from the eons of cosmic development we've explored together. The legendary Pokémon that have shaped the universe from its very beginning to the complex multidimensional reality we know today represent something far more fundamental than simply powerful creatures with extraordinary abilities. They are the living embodiments of the eternal forces that govern all existence. Manifestations of principles so basic to reality that without them, nothing we recognize as the Pokémon universe could exist. From Arceus's emergence from the primordial void to the latest discoveries about temporal paradoxes and artificial creation, each legendary Pokémon represents an aspect of the cosmic order that transcends any individual story or regional mythology. The patterns that have emerged throughout this timeline reveal the deep interconnectedness of all legendary Pokémon, regardless of when they first appeared or which region claims them as guardians. Dialga's mastery over time connects directly to Celebi's forest preservation and Terrapagos's temporal crystallization. Kyogre's ocean creation flows through Lugia's storm mediation to Necrozma's light distribution across dimensional boundaries. The Lake Guardian's gift of consciousness echoes in every artificial Pokémon's struggle for identity and purpose. What makes these connections even more remarkable is how they've evolved to accommodate challenges that their original creators never anticipated. The cosmic organizational networks that began with simple opposition between Kyogre and Groudon have grown sophisticated enough to integrate artificial legendary Pokémon, manage temporal paradoxes, and coordinate activities across multiple dimensional frameworks simultaneously. This adaptability suggests that legendary Pokémon are not static cosmic fixtures, but are themselves capable of growth and learning in response to universal development. The emergence of artificial legendaries like Mewtwo and Type Null has added new dimensions to this eternal cycle, demonstrating that the principles embodied by legendary Pokémon can be accessed through technological means, though never without consequence. These artificial entities serve as bridges between the ancient cosmic forces and the technological civilizations that have learned to work alongside them, creating hybrid approaches to cosmic management that combine natural wisdom with innovative problem-solving. Perhaps most significantly, the timeline we've explored reveals that legendary Pokémon have consistently served as teachers and guides for the civilizations that encounter them, even when those encounters begin with conflict or misunderstanding. The collaborative protocols that now govern legendary Pokémon interactions emerged from countless experiences of resolving conflicts between opposing forces, integrating incompatible perspectives, and finding ways for entities with vastly different natures to work together toward common goals. The story continues to unfold even now, with new discoveries about ancient civilizations and their legendary partners, new Pokémon emerging from previously unknown dimensional spaces, and new challenges arising from the intersection of cosmic forces with ever-advancing technology. Each new chapter adds depth and complexity to the eternal cycle, while revealing how the fundamental patterns established in the universe's earliest moments continue influencing events across cosmic scales. As you drift toward sleep, carried by the gentle flow of these ancient stories, remember that you are part of this continuing narrative. The consciousness that the Lake Guardians embedded in the universe's structure lives in every thinking being, connecting you to the same creative forces that shaped legendary Pokémon themselves. In your dreams, you may touch the same temporal streams that Celebi navigates, experience the same dimensional boundaries that separate our world from ultraspace, or feel the echo of that primordial moment when Arceus first brought order from chaos. The eternal cycle continues, and through understanding these legendary histories, we become part of the ongoing story that will determine how the next chapters of cosmic development unfold across the infinite expanse of space and time.